come and sit a while, and let the fire do the speaking when my voice grows soft. The night outside this house is old and very deep, and the river runs below the windows, as it has run for an age of the world, carrying the small sounds of the dark down toward the sea. I have books before me, older than the trees that shade this valley. And tonight, while the candles last and the embers hold, I will read them to you the way they were meant to be heard, slowly, without hurry, the way one tells the longest of all stories to someone they hope will fall gently to sleep before the saddest parts arrive. Before I begin, let me say plainly what this telling is, so that no scholar of later days will frown at it. This is an original narrative journey through the history of Middle-earth, inspired by the works of J.R.R. Tolkien. It is an unofficial exploration of his legendarium, sung again in my own quiet voice. The songs themselves are far older than I am, and where I add a turn of phrase or imagine a face by firelight, you will know it for what it is, a lore master's love, not the dry letter of the chronicles. With that said, lay your head back and let us go down together into the time before time, when there was no sun, no moon, no land, and no sea. In the beginning there was Iru, the one, who in the speech of the Elves is called Ilvata, the father of all. He dwelt alone in a place that was not a place, in a silence that was not yet broken, before the world was, and before the void around the world had any meaning. And out of his thought he made the Ainur, the holy ones, who were the offspring of his mind before anything else at all was made. Ki were with him, and to each he gave understanding of the part of his mind from which each had come, so that one might love water, and another the high cold winds, and another the deep places of stone, and no two of them were entirely alike. For a long age that cannot be measured, the Ainur sang only alone or in small companies, each unfolding the theme that Ilvatar had set within them, while the rest listened and grew in wisdom by the listening. They learned the music of one another slowly, as you might learn a friend's voice across years, and in this way their harmony deepened until it reached toward something none of them yet understood. Then Ilvatar called them all together, and he declared to them a mighty theme, greater than any he had shown them before, and its beauty was such that many of them bowed their heads and were silent, for they did not know what to make of so vast a gift. And he bade them make a great music upon this theme, each adorning it with his own thought and skill, and he said that he would sit and listen and be glad. Then the voices of the Ainur began to weave a music of endless interchanging melodies, passing beyond hearing into the heights and the depths, until the place of the dwelling of Ilvatar was filled to overflowing in the music, and the echo of the music went out into the emptiness, and the emptiness was no longer empty. Never since has there been any music so great, though it is said that a greater shall be made before the end of days, when the choirs of the Ainur and the children of Ilvatar shall sing together, and at last comprehend the meaning of their own song. For now, in the deeps of that first making, everything was new, and the joy of it was a clean joy without any shadow upon it, though shadow, even then, was coming. Among the Ainur there was one whom Ilvatar had given the greatest gifts of power and knowledge, and he had a share in all the gifts of his brethren. His name in the beginning was Melkor, he who arises in might. It was his pride that ruined him, for he went often into the empty places seeking the flame imperishable, the secret fire that gives true being to things, that he might bring his own creations into the world, and be a lord and a maker in his own right. But the flame is with Ilvatar, and is not to be found in the void, and Melkor's long searching alone in the dark sowed in him thoughts that were not in tune with the thoughts of his brethren. So, when the great music rose to its height, Melkor began to weave into it matters of his own imagining, loud and proud, and they were not in accord with the theme of Ilvatar. Some of those near him in the song faltered and fell silent, dismayed, and their music grew weak, and some began to attune their own singing to Melkor's rather than to the thought they had at first conceived. The discord spread like a stain in clear water, and the music about the throne of Elvitar was troubled by a sea of turbulent sound, wave upon wave of it striving against the older harmonies, till much of the singing seemed to drown in a roaring as of dark and angry waters. Yet Ilvatar sat and hearkened, and he did not rise in anger, and for a long while he smiled. Then he lifted up his left hand, and a new theme began amid the storm, like and yet unlike the former theme, and it gathered power and had a new and quiet beauty. But the discord of Melkor rose in uproar to contend with it, and there was again a war of sound, more violent than before. Again, Ilvatar lifted up his right hand, and he was no longer smiling, but weeping. And a third theme grew amid the confusion, and it was unlike the others. For it seemed at first soft and sweet, a mere rippling of gentle sounds and delicate melodies, but it could not be quenched, and it took to itself power and profundity. And it seemed at the last that two musics were progressing at one time before the seat of Ilvatar, utterly opposed, the one deep and wide and beautiful, but slow and blended with an immeasurable sorrow, from which its beauty chiefly came, sped the other, loud and vain and endlessly repeated, with little harmony but a clamorous unison as of many trumpets braying upon a few notes. And the loud music tried to drown the other, yet it seemed that its most triumphant notes were taken up by the other and woven into its own solemn pattern. In the midst of this strife, whereat the halls of Ilvatar shook and a tremor ran out into the silences, yet unmoved, Ilvatar arose a third time, and his face was terrible to behold. He lifted up both his hands, and in one chord, deeper than the abyss, higher than the firmament, piercing as the light of the eye of Ilvata, the music ceased. Then Ilvata spoke, and he said that no theme may be played that has not its uttermost source in him, and that no one may alter the music in his despite. For he that attempts this shall prove in the end but an instrument in the devising of things more wonderful, which that one has not himself imagined. This is the deepest comfort in all the long histories I shall tell you tonight, child, and I want you to hold it close as the dark gathers, that nothing the shadow ever did in all the ages of marring and ruin fell outside the great design, and even the sorrow it made became, in the end, part of a beauty too vast for any single voice to sing. Then Ilvatar took them out into the void and showed them what their music had become, a vision of a world, a globe of light hanging amid the dark, and it began to unfold and to move as if it lived. Akana looked upon it with wonder and with love, and they beheld the lands and the seas and the kindling of stars, Kana, and the deeps of time rolling forward toward, to strange and beautiful kindreds, whom Elvator alone had set within the third theme, the children of Elvator, the elves and men, who came not from the minds of the Anor, but from the heart of the one. And of all the parts of the vision the Anor loved men and elves the most, the elves for their unstained beauty and their long allegiance to the world, and men for the strange gift given them alone, the gift of seeking beyond the world, and of shaping their lives amid the powers and chances of the world, beyond even the music of the Anor. But the vision was taken away and hidden, and Ilvatar spoke the word that gave it true and lasting being. He said, Let these things be. And the world was no longer a vision in the dark, but a thing wrought and real, set amid the void, and yet not of it. Many of the Anar were still enamored of the beauty they had seen, and they begged leave to enter into it, and Ilvatar granted it. And so the Valar, the powers of the world, descended into the beginning of time, into a place that was at first formless and very far from the perfection they had glimpsed. There they would have to make it real with their own hands, slowly, mountain by mountain and shore by shore, and they took shapes and hues from the world they loved, clothing themselves in form as we put on garments. I will tell you the names of a few of them now, gently, the way you learn the names of stars before you can find them. There was Manwë, dearest to Ilvator, lord of the airs and the winds, who understood most clearly the purposes of the one. There was Olmo, lord of all waters, who loved best of all to dwell alone in the deeps and the rivers, and would not make for himself any settled house. And Alla, the smith and maker, who delighted in the substances of the earth, in metals and gems and the fashioning of things. And Javanna, the giver of fruits, who loved all things that grow, the least moss upon a stone and the tallest tree, and grieved already for them, though they did not yet exist. And there was Varda, lady of the stars, fairest and most revered of all, of whom I shall sing much before this night is through. There were others among the great ones, whose names you should carry softly into your sleep, for they move through all that follows. There was Mandos, the keeper of the houses of the dead, who knows all things that shall be save only those that lie still in the freedom of Ilvatar, and whose word, once spoken in doom, does not turn aside. There was his brother Irmo, whom they called Lorien, after his gardens, master of visions and of dreams, in whose quiet land the weary spirits of the world might find rest. And there was Niana, who dwells alone and mourns, whose weeping is not despair, but the slow turning of grief into wisdom and pity, and who taught the meaning of sorrow to many before the end. There was Oromo, the great hunter, who alone of the Valar would still ride at times into the darkened lands of the east upon his white horse, with his horn ringing among the unlit hills. And there was Tolkus the strong, last of the Valar to come into the world, who laughs in battle, and whose coming first drove Melkor back into the dark. Beneath the Valar there came also a great host of lesser spirits, the Maiar, who were of the same order, but of less might, and who served the powers, each according to their nature. Some of them you will meet again in shapes you would not now guess. There was Enwul, the herald of Manwë, mightiest in arms of all the dwellers in Ammon. And there was Ilmoru, the handmaid of Arda. There was Olorine, wisest of the Maiar, who walked unseen among the children and put courage and good counsel into their hearts, and who, in a far later age, would take a great cloak and a staff and a name that the small folk of a green country would learn to love. And there was one, mighty among the people of Ola, who in the beginning was not evil, but was drawn down by the lore of order made absolute, and of a lore, and of a will, and of a will, and of name, and of names, and his nade, and his name, and his name, and his night, and a night, and two I light, I want the mother lie, I lie, I lie, I lie. We are do it. Oh, we go with the back. Oh, God, go up, God, and I cook up. I move up more. We tell, we go, well, I can't. Into that newborn world, even as the Valar set their first labors, came Melkor also, descending in might and majesty, for he claimed the world for his own kingdom. Wherever the others built, he marred. Wherever they kindled, he quenched. The long ages of the shaping of Arda were a contention between making and unmaking, and the world was never afterward holy as the music had foretold. Yet, do not yet feel the sorrow too keenly, for the Valar labored on, and Olmo's waters found their channels, and Javanna's mind was already full of green things, waiting in the dark for their season. The first marring did not undo the world. It only meant that everything beautiful in it would be the more precious for being threatened, and that every triumph in the long defeat to come would shine the brighter against the dark. So the music passed into silence, and the silence into time, and the Valar stood upon the foundations of a world that was theirs to finish. There was no sun to warm it, and no moon to silver the night. There were only the first faint lights they themselves had kindled, and a great work waiting. in the patience of beings who reckoned the slow turning of an age, the way you and I might count the passing of a single quiet hour. Listen now to how still the house has become, and how the fire has settled to a low and steady glow. Oh, the world has only just begun, and already it is older than any sorrow you have ever known, and we have all the long night before us, and many lamps yet to light. The Valar labored long in the unshaped world, and we, who count years as small things, can scarcely imagine the patience of that work. Where the raising of a mountain range might be the labor of an age, and the carving of a single seabed, the quiet task of 100 lifetimes of trees. They gathered the world together and ordered it, and they sought to make it ready for the coming of the children. Though the hour of that coming lay still far off in the deeps of time, if you know this, Melkor was their adversary, and what they made, he twisted. If you know where they sought symmetry and peace, he set discord and ruin, so that the very bones of the earth were laid crooked, and the seas were never wholly still. Yet, for a time, the Valar prevailed, and a measure of order came upon Arda, and the long night of the unlit world was made ready to receive its first great light. It was Alla, the smith of the Valar, who wrought the two mighty lamps to illumine the world. And Varda filled them with light, and Manol hallowed them, and they were set upon great pillars, taller than any mountains of the later world. One lamp they named Iluin, and it stood in the north of Middle-earth, and the other they named Ormal, and it stood in the south. The light of the two lamps flowed out over the earth, and met and mingled in the middle regions, so that all was lit as with a changeless day, soft and silver golden, and without shadow. In that long noon, the seeds that Javanna had sown began at last to stir, and the world grew green. Then the Valar gathered to dwell upon an island in the midst of a great lake. In the center of Middle-earth, where the light of both lamps was strongest, and that island they named Almoran. There they made their first home, and it was the fairest place that had yet been in all the world, fairer perhaps than anything that came after, for it was new and unmarred, and full of the joy of beginnings. About Almoran, the earth flowered, and the beasts came forth, and the forests grew tall and dark and deep, and rivers ran clear over their stones. And this time the chroniclers named the spring of Arda, for it was the springtime of the world, and in it the labor of the Valar found its reward. Of all the ages I shall tell you of tonight, this was the one most full of innocent gladness, and it is right that you should rest a moment within it before we go on. Let me bring you down then from the great heights of history into a single quiet hour, the way I promised I would. Imagine Javanna walking alone in the green of Almoran in the unchanging light, her feet in the cool grass, and her hands trailing over the new-made leaves, naming under her breath the things she had so long imagined, and now at last could touch. There were no withered flowers there, for nothing had yet died. There were no fallen leaves, for autumn had not yet been invented. Cheese, there was only the slow swelling of bud into bloom, and a patient green pressing upward toward a light that did not fade. She loved each growing thing with a particular love, as a mother loves not children in general, but this child and that one by name, and she walked among them in a happiness so complete that she did not think to fear for them, though she, of all the Valar, would come to grieve the most. There is a particular sweetness in a thing that has never yet been broken, and that sweetness lay over all of Almoran in those days like the light itself. The beasts of the field had not learned to flee, for nothing had ever hunted them. The birds sang without any sorrow in their songs, for they had never seen a winter. And the great forest stood in a green and dreaming patience, growing toward a noon that seemed as though it would never end. Javanna knew, with a deep foreknowledge that was in all the Valar, that the world would change, and that seasons and endings would one day come. And yet, to walk in the unfallen garden was to set that knowledge aside for a while, and simply to be glad. and I think she lingered there longer than she needed to. The way we linger in a happiness we sense is passing. For the peace of the spring of Arda did not last, and it was Melkor who broke it, as he broke all things he could not own. He had withdrawn beyond the walls of night when the valor grew strong, and he watched the kindling of the lamps with hatred and with envy, biding his time in the cold and the dark, while the valor rested from their long labors, thinking the world made safe. He came back secretly into the north, and there, in the regions beneath the lamp Lúthien, he delved a vast fortress deep in the earth, which afterward was called Utumno, the first of the deep dungeons of the enemies of the world. The cold of it crept out and slew the green things and sickened the beasts, and the Valar perceived at last that their adversary had returned. But before they could come against him in their strength, he struck. Melkor assailed the lamps and cast them both down, and the pillars that upheld them were broken, and in their fall the lands were riven and the seas rose up in great and ruinous waves. The light that had filled the world was spilled and scattered. Fire ran from the broken lamps and scorched the earth, so that the shape of Arda was marred a second time, and never again was made as it had been. Elmoron the Fair, the first home of the Valar, was destroyed in that overthrow, and the island and its green gardens were ruined and unmade, and Yavanna's springtime was ended in fire and flood, in a sudden, terrible dark. I tell this part softly, for it is the first great grief of the chronicles, the first time that something truly beautiful was lost beyond recovery, and the memory of Elmoron would lie in the heart of Yavanna ever after, like the memory of a face one will not see again. In the confusion of that ruin Melkor escaped once more, for the Valar were taken up with restraining the violence of the seas and shielding what little they could of their work, and they could not at the same time make war upon him. So he sat secure in Utumno in the north, and his shadow lengthened over Middle-earth. And the lands east of the great sea fell into a long darkness, lit only by the cold and distant stars. The Valar took counsel, and they perceived that they could no longer keep their dwelling in the midst of Middle-earth, where it lay open to assault, and where the marring ran deepest. Therefore they departed over the sea into the uttermost west, and there in the land of Ammon, beyond the encircling waters, they made their second and final home. That land was named Valinor, the land of the Valar, and it was guarded as the first home had not been. Along its eastern shore the Valar raised the Pelori, the mountains of defense, the highest mountains upon the earth, a sheer and towering wall against the east, and against any assault that might come over the sea. Behind that wall they built their mansions and their gardens and their domes, and they recovered, in part, the beauty that had been lost. And upon the heights of Tanaketl, the tallest of the Pelori, Manno and Varda, set their thrones, whence Manno could look out over all the world, and Varda could turn her starlit eyes back toward the dark of Middle-earth that they had been forced to abandon. It was a fair land, fairer than Middle-earth, and unshadowed. And yet there was a sorrow folded into its making, for the Valar had withdrawn behind walls, and the world east of the sea was left to lie under the shadow, and a part of the purpose of the powers had failed. Think for a moment of what was lost when the lamps fell. Beyond the breaking of the lands, the changeless light was gone, the light without shadow that had filled every hour alike. And in its place there came for the first time true night, deep and unbroken. Over all the lands that lay outside the west, the world had been made to have a beginning of shadows and of differing hours, but it had not been made to lie in a single endless dark, and there was a wrongness in that long blackness that even the beasts felt and feared. Yet here is a strange mercy hidden in the chronicles, and I want you to hear it before you sleep, that it was precisely this darkness which made the stars worth the making, for in a world of changeless noon, no one would ever have lifted their eyes to wonder, and Varda's greatest work would never have been needed nor loved. Consider, in the quiet of this hour, what that withdrawal meant. The keepers of the world had built themselves a refuge and shut the gate of the mountains behind them. And though they did it from wisdom and not from cowardice, still the lands where the children of Elvada would one day awaken were left without protection, in cold and in starlight and in fear. There is a kind of grief that has no remedy, the grief of having to choose the lesser sorrow, and the Valar knew it then. For they loved the world entire, and could no longer hold it entire, and so they held the west and let the rest go dark. This is a sorrow you will meet again and again before the night is out, child, the sorrow of the long defeat, of the good that must give ground, of the beautiful thing that cannot be everywhere defended at once. Hold it lightly for now, for the chronicles do not end in that dark, though they pass through much of it. So Middle-earth lay under the stars in the keeping of no one, in Melkor's power spread out from Utumno like cold from an open door in winter. He made foul things in the deep places, and his servants gathered to him. And among the spirits that had entered the world there were some, the Mire, lesser than the Valar, but mighty still, who were seduced to his service and became creatures of dread. Among them were some of fiery nature, whom afterward the Elves named Balrogs, demons of shadow and of flame, and these became the most dreaded of his captains in the wars that were yet to come. In the deep places beneath the cold mountains, Melkor bent his whole will to the unmaking of beauty. And the chronicles speak of the horrors bred there in the long dark, though they speak of them from far off and with their faces turned away. He delved his dungeons ever deeper, and he raised a second stronghold, the western outpost of his power, set in the ranges nearer the sea, that he might watch against any return of the Valar. And the whole north of Middle-earth groaned beneath his hand. I will not linger among these makings, for they are foul, and the purpose of this telling is rest and not dread. 'Tis enough that you should know the dark was real and deep and very old, so that the lights to come will mean to you what they meant to those who first looked up and beheld them. Yet even in this darkest of the early ages, hope was not wholly absent, for the Valar in the west did not forget the east. And Varda, above all, turned her thought again and again to the lands that lay in shadow. She remembered that the third theme of the music had promised the coming of the children, and she knew that they would awaken not in the lit and guarded west, but out there, beneath the bare and starless dark, and her heart was moved, Long she sat upon the heights of Tannakettle and looked eastward, and a great resolve grew in her, a work of love undertaken against the whole weight of the shadow, for she perceived that lights set high and far in the deeps of heaven would hang forever beyond the reach of any malice that crept upon the earth. And so, as this chapter of the world draws toward its close, the stage is set for one of the most beautiful of all the deeds of the Valar, for the kindling of new lights. Not lamps upon pillars that an enemy might cast down, but stars hung high and far in the deeps of heaven, where no hand of Melkor could reach to quench them. The night outside our window is full of such stars, even now, and when you look at them tomorrow, you may think of this, that long ago they were made on purpose, in love and in defiance, so that the first eyes ever to open in Middle-earth would open not upon an empty blackness, but upon a sky already strewn with silver. Rest now in the dark between the lights, for the lamps are fallen and the trees are not yet grown, and in that pause the whole world is waiting. We will light the stars together in the next breath of the story, and beneath them, at last, something will awaken that can look up and wonder. So we come at last out of the long, unlit dark and into the kindling of new light. And this is one of the gentlest passages in all the history of the world. So let your breathing slow as we enter it, while Varda prepared her great work among the stars. Javanna and her sister Nianna came together in Valinor upon a green mound called Isola, before the western gate of the Valar city, and there Javanna sang a song of deep enchantment, while Nianna watered the mound with her tears. Out of that singing and that weeping there grew two slender shoots, and they rose and budded and came to flower, and they became the most beloved of all the works of the Valar, the two trees of Valinor. They were the heart of the light of that blessed land, and there has been nothing like them in the world before or since. The elder of the trees was named Telperion, and his leaves were dark green above and shining silver beneath. And from his countless flowers there fell a dew of silver light. The younger was Lorelin, whose young leaves were like the new green of beech, and whose flowers hung in clusters of flame, pouring forth a golden warmth. Each tree waxed to full brightness, and then waned again over the slow hours, and as one dimmed, the other kindled, so that there came a soft mingling of silver and gold twice in each of their days. And by the waxing and waning of the trees, the Valar reckoned their hours, and counted the long years of the trees, which were each as long to us as many of our years. In the light of those trees, the Valar walked in gladness, and Valinor was filled with a radiance that the marred lands of Middle-earth would never know. But Middle-earth still lay in starless gloom, and there it was that Varda's great work was wrought. And there, at last, the world received the gift for which it had been waiting, taking the gathered silver dews of Telperion, the dews of that ancient and holy light. Varda went up into the heavens, and there she made new stars and set them in the sky, brighter and more numerous than any that had been since the deeps of time. She wrought great constellations in token of things to come and of the watchfulness of the Valar. She set the figure of a mighty warrior in the sky, Manella Makar with his shining belt, who foreshadowed the last battle that shall be at the ending of days. And high in the north, as a challenge to Melkor and a sign of his doom, she hung the 7 bright stars of the sickle of the Valar, wheeling forever about the pole. It was the greatest of all the works of the Valar since their coming into Arda, and the Elves have loved Varda above all the powers ever since, naming her Elbrith, the Queen of the Stars, and calling upon her name in their darkest hours. And it came to pass that in the very hour when Varda finished her labors, and the new stars first blazed forth over the dark and waiting lands, the children of Ilvator awoke at last in the world. Far in the east of Middle-earth, by the shores of a mere of clear water under the new stars, in a place called Quiviana, the water of awakening, the Elves opened their eyes for the first time. The first thing that they ever saw was the starlit sky, and the first sound that they ever heard was the murmur of water over stone, and for that reason the Elves have loved the stars and the sound of flowing water above all other things, all the long ages of the world. Think of it, child, as you lie here in the dark, the eldest of all the speaking peoples woke to a night not so very different from this one, and the first thing they did was to look up and to wonder. For a long while the Elves dwelt by the waters of Quivianan under the stars, and they grew in beauty and in skill, and they began to make speech and to give names to all the things they saw. For they were lovers of words from the beginning. They were tall and fair, even then, in the first freshness of their making, and they delighted in all that they beheld, in the water, in the trees, and the wheeling lights above them. And they had no memory of any time before their waking, so that the starlit world seemed to them wholly new, and every dawn of understanding was a wonder that they shared with one another in their growing speech. It is said that the very first word they ever devised was a name for the lights above them, for the stars were the first thing they marveled at. In the making of that word was the beginning of all the languages that have ever been spoken in the world. They called themselves the Quindi, which means those that speak with voices. For in those first days they knew of no other living things that could shape words. And the gift of speech seemed to them the most wonderful of all that they had been given. By the still water they sang the first songs, songs without sorrow, because they had not yet learned what sorrow was. And they walked in companies beneath the constellations, telling one another the names of all that they could see, and inventing names for all that they could imagine. There was something in that early time that the elves never afterward recovered, and never ceased to long for, the freshness of a world being named for the very first time, when every word was a discovery and every star was new. They wandered far in the dim starlit lands, and yet there was a shadow upon the edges of their wandering, for Melkor knew of their coming and set a fear about them. And it is told that any of the elves who strayed alone too far were sometimes taken and were never seen again. And a dread of the hunter, a rider in the dark, fell upon them. It was indeed a rider in the dark who came among them at last, but he was not the hunter they feared. For it was Oromu, the great Vala, hunting in the east, as was his wont, who came upon the elves by chance under the stars. And seeing them, he was filled with wonder and delight, as though he had come suddenly upon some treasure, long foretold, but unlooked for. Yet many of the elves fled from Oromu in their fear, for the lies of Melkor had taught them to dread any great rider. And only slowly did they learn that this shining horseman meant them no harm. When the Valar learned from Oromu that the children had at last awakened, great change of counsel came upon them, and they resolved that they must now make war upon Melkor for the sake of the elves and free the world from his shadow. So came the first great war of the powers, the Battle of the Powers, and the Valar came in force out of the west and assailed Melkor in his northern strongholds. And the war was terrible, and the shape of Middle-earth was changed again by it, but I will pass over it lightly, for it was waged far from the elves and is told only in glimpses. In the end, Melkor was overthrown and bound in an unbreakable chain, and he was taken back to Valinor and shut in the halls of Mandos for 3 long ages, and the world had peace, though much of his evil lay hidden still in the deep places of the earth. Now the Valar were troubled in their hearts concerning the elves, for they wished to gather them into the light and safety of the west, away from the dangers of Middle-earth and from the lingering malice of Melkor's works. So they summoned the elves to come and dwell with them in Valinor, and after long doubt, the elves sent 3 of their leaders to behold the blessed realm. These returned, filled with the light of the trees, and counseled their people to make the great journey west. Yet not all would go, and here came the first great sundering of the elves, the first of the partings that run like a slow sorrow through all their history. Those who refused the summons and would not leave the starlit lands of their awakening were named the Avari, the unwilling, and of them few tales are told. But those who set out upon the westward march were named the Eldar, the people of the stars. The Eldar were 3 kindreds upon that long road, and you should hold their names gently, for they shape all that follows. First went the Vanyar, the fair elves, the smallest in number and the most beloved of the Valar, led by Ingvi, who became the high king of all the elves. Then came the Noldor, the deep elves, lovers of knowledge and of craft. Ka, led by Finwë, who would give the world both its brightest and its most grievous histories. And last and most numerous came the Teleri, who loved music and the water and were slow upon the road, led by the brothers Elwë and Olwë. And it is among the Teleri, the dawdlers and the singers, that the tenderest tale of this age is found. The road west was long beyond the reckoning of mortal years, and it led the Eldar over wide plains and through old forests, and at last up against the great range of the misty mountains, which rose then, as they rise now, like a wall across the world. Many marvels and many fears lay along that march, and not all who set out upon it endured to the end. For when the host came to the mountains, a part of the Teleri were afraid of the high passes and the cold, and they turned aside and journeyed south down the long vale of a great river, and were lost to their kin for an age. These were the Nandor, and they became a woodland and a river people, and though some of them found their way west again in later days, the sundering of the elves was thus deepened, one parting laid upon another, until the single people that had awakened by one starlit mere was scattered into many kindreds across the breadth of Middle-earth. See it is, child, with all long journeys and all great families, that the further they go, the more they divide, and the road that begins with one people ends with one people, each carrying a different memory of where they all began. Let me bring you down now from the great march of kindreds to a single still moment in a darkening wood, for this is the intimate heart of the chapter. As the host of the Teleri came westward through the lands east of the sea, Elwu, their lord, who was tall and great and the greatest of them, went one evening alone into a forest of starlit trees called Non-Elmeth, seeking his friend among the Noldor. And in that wood he heard the voices of nightingales, and following their song he came upon Melian, a Maya of great beauty and power, who had come from the gardens of Lorien, and who loved to walk in the twilight of Middle-earth. She stood among the trees in the starlight, and a light was in her eyes like the light of the stars themselves, and Elwu looked upon her and was lost, but it was the sweetest losing that ever a soul knew, for he came toward her and took her hand, and a great enchantment fell upon them both, and they stood there together, saying no word, under the wheeling stars, while the long years of the world flowed past them unheeded. His people sought him and could not find him, and at last the rest of the Teleri went on without their lord, or waited, and then despaired. But Elwu did not stir, and Melian did not stir, and the trees of Nan-Elmeth grew tall and dark about them as the slow ages passed. There is no other love quite like this in all the chronicles, a love so deep that it stopped time, that made two beings stand entranced while kingdoms gathered and seas were crossed, content beyond all telling simply to be in one another's presence. When at last they woke from that long spell, an age had passed, and the trees were old, and Elwu never went over the sea, but he became a great king in Middle-earth, and Melian his queen, and their love bound Amaya to the fate of the world, with consequences of surpassing beauty and surpassing sorrow that we shall come to in their time. So the kindreds passed on toward the sea, and Omo himself came to ferry them across the wide water, drawing a great island like a ship to bear the Vanya and the Noldor first, and later the Teleri over the long leagues to the shores of Aman. The Teleri lingered even at the end, for many of them loved the seas and the shores of Middle-earth, and some were left behind upon the western coasts. And these became the Sindar, the Grey Elves, the people that Elwu would rule when he woke at last from his enchantment under his new name, Thingol, the Grey Cloak. But the greater part came at last into the light of the trees, and dwelt upon the shores of Aman, and in the city of the Noldor, and in those years was the high noon of the elves in the world, a time of peace and making and learning beneath the silver and the gold. Let the pacing slow now, almost to a whisper, for the chapter is ending, and there is a sweetness here worth resting in. Picture the elves of that early world, before any grief had touched them, walking by the waters under stars that had been made on purpose for their waking eyes. Picture Elwu and Melian standing in the still wood while the nightingales sang and time forgot to move. Picture the two trees mingling their silver and their gold over a land that had not yet known a single tear. All of this was real, and all of it was good, and none of it could last, for the elves are the people of the long memory and the long farewell, and even in their brightest morning there was already the faint, far note of an evening yet to come. Sleep now, if you can, in the starlight and the music, for in the next part of the tale a fire is kindled among the Noldor that will burn far brighter and far more terribly than the trees, and after it the world is never quite so gentle again. Now we come to the brightest and the most terrible chapter of the Elder Days, and I will tell it slowly, for though there is great sorrow in it, there is also a beauty so high that it set the course of all the ages to follow. In the city of the Noldor, upon a green hill in Aman, in the white tower Tirion beneath the light of the trees, there dwelt Finwë the king, beloved of his people, who had led the Noldor on the long march from the waters of awakening. His first wife was Miriel, called the Broideress for the surpassing skill of her hands, and she bore him a son, in whom the fire of the Noldor burned hotter than in any other who ever lived. and that son was named Foiner, spirit of fire. But in the bearing of him, Miriel was consumed, and her strength of body and of spirit was spent. And after his birth, she went to the gardens of Lorien to rest, and there laid down her life, departing to the silent halls of Mandos and refusing ever to return. This was the first death of one of the Eldar in the blessed realm, and it cast the first true shadow of grief upon the deathless land. For the Elves of Ammon had thought themselves beyond such sorrow. Finwë grieved long for Miriel, and at length he wedded a second time, taking to wife Indiz of the Vanyar, and she bore him 2 sons, Fingolfin and Finarfin, and daughters also. And from these came the great houses of the Noldor, whose deeds filled the histories. Yet Foiner loved his mother's memory, and did not love his father's second house, and there was a coldness in his heart toward his half-brothers from the beginning, a small seed of division that Melkor would one day find and water until it grew into ruin. So even in the happiest of households, in the fairest of lands, the first griefs and the first jealousies took root, as quietly as frost gathers on a still night. Foina grew to be the mightiest of all the Noldor in skill of hand and in subtlety of mind, a maker and a craftsman without equal in the history of the Elves, restless and proud and burning ever with an inner flame. He it was who first devised the letters that the Elves used to write down their tongue, and he wrought many marvels in metal and in gem. But the greatest of all his works, and the most fateful, were the 3 jewels that he made in a time of inspiration that never came to him again. Taking the very light of the 2 trees, the mingled silver and gold of Telperion and Lorelin, he captured it and held it within a crystal substance of his own devising, harder than diamond and clearer than the clearest water. And so he made the Silmarils. They shone with their own light, the living light of the trees, in the days of their bliss, and all who beheld them were filled with wonder and with longing, and even the Valar marveled. And Varda hallowed them so that no unclean thing could touch them and live, and Mandos foretold that the fates of Arda lay locked within them. Now, Melkor had been released at the ending of his 3 ages of imprisonment in the halls of Mandos, for he had feigned repentance and humility, and the Valar in their mercy had set him free, hoping that he was healed. But the malice in him was not lessened, only hidden, and he walked now among the Elves of Valinor, wearing a fair face and speaking fair words. And, most of all, he turned his envy and his cunning upon the Noldor, the most skilled and the most eager for knowledge. He desired the Silmarils above all things with a desire that became a torment to him, and he plotted in secret to possess them and to bring ruin upon the Maker. But first he set himself to poison the peace of the Noldor with whispers, for he was the father of lies, and knew that a kingdom is more easily broken from within than from without. To Foiner he hinted that the Valar had brought the Elves to Aemon only to keep them captive, that Middle-earth might be ruled by others. And to the rest of the Noldor he whispered of the favor shown to Foiner, and to Foiner he whispered of the ambition of his half-brothers. So discord grew in Tirion that had never been there before, and pride and suspicion turned brother against brother. And at last a day came when Foiner, believing the lies, drew his sword upon his half-brother Fingolfin in the very halls of the king and threatened his life. For this breaking of the peace of Valinor, the Valar called Foina to judgment, and they perceived at last the hand of Melkor in the matter. Yet, because Foenar had drawn the sword, he was banished from Tirion for 12 years, and he went north and built a stronghold called Forminos, and there he kept the Silmarils locked in a chamber of iron. And Finwë, his father, who loved him beyond all reason, went with him into his exile and dwelt with him at Forminos, leaving his kingdom in the keeping of Fingolfin, so that even the king followed his fiery son into the shadow of his pride. Melkor, his treachery half uncovered, fled from Valinor, and the Valar sought him, but could not find him, for he had gone south into a region of deep shadow, where there dwelt a being of dreadful and ancient evil, a spirit of devouring darkness in the form of a monstrous spider, named Ungoliant. She hungered for light, only that she might destroy it, swallowing it into an unlight that was the negation of all radiance. And Melkor made a dark bargain with her, promising her glut and gorging if she would aid him in his revenge. Together, they crept back into Valinor at a time of festival, when the trees were waning toward the mingling hour, and the Valar and the Elves were gathered in celebration upon Tanaketel, and many places lay unwatched. And in that hour, Melkor smote the two trees, piercing them so that their sap ran out, and Ungoliant set her black lips to the wounds and drank until she had sucked up all their light and poured forth a darkness unlight in which even the Valar were blinded. So perished the two trees of Valinor, the light that had been the heart of the blessed realm since before the Elves awoke. And a great darkness fell upon Aemon that had never known true dark in all its days. I want you to feel the weight of this, and then let it pass gently, for it is one of the saddest losses in all the chronicles. The light that Javanna had sung into being upon the green mound, watered with the tears of Niana, was gone out of the world forever, and only in the 3 Silmarils of Foinir did any of it now remain locked in iron at Forminos. The Valar were plunged into grief and confusion, groping in the unlight, and Javanna said that she could make the trees live again only with the light that lay sealed within the jewels, and Foinir summoned, found that he could not bring himself to give them up, for they were the work of his heart, and even to save the trees he would not break them. While he wrestled with that terrible choice, messengers came running out of the north with worse tidings still. For Melkor in the darkness had gone to Forminos, and there he had slain Finwë the king upon the threshold of the treasury, the first slaying of one of the Eldar by an enemy in the blessed realm, and he had broken the iron chamber and carried away the Silmarils and all the other jewels of the Noldor besides. Then Foinir, hearing that his father was murdered and his life's work stolen in a single stroke, was filled with a grief and a wrath so great that they unhinged him, and in his rage he named Melkor anew, calling him Morgoth, the black foe of the world, the name by which he was known ever after among the Noldor. And Foinir cursed the hour that he had let the lying spirit into the city, and he ran from the place of judgment into the dark. But the loss of his father grieved him even more than the loss of the jewels, and the two griefs together drove out of him all patience and all wisdom. Now Morgoth fled north out of a man with Ungoliant, but in the wastes she demanded the rest of his promised payment, and would have devoured even the Silmarils he clutched. And there was strife between them, and Morgoth cried out a great cry, and his Balrogs came to his aid out of the deep ruins of his old strongholds, and drove Ungoliant away. So he came at last back into Middle-earth, into the north, and there he raised again a mighty fortress over the deep dungeons of his ancient delvings, and above it he piled 3 great peaks of ash and slag, the towers of Thangaradrim. In the whole region he made into a kingdom of dread, named Angband, the Iron Prison. And he set the 3 Silmarils within an iron crown upon his head, and the holy jewels burned his hands and his brow with a pain he could never be rid of. Yet he would not give them up, for the possession of them was become the chief joy and the chief torment of his existence. Back in darkened Valinor, Foinir did a deed that shaped the doom of the Eldar for all the ages to come. He gathered the Noldor together in the great square of Tirion beneath the starlight. For the trees were dead, and there was no other light, and he spoke to them with a fire of words such as had never been heard before nor since, mingling truth and grief and pride and the poison Morgoth had left in him. He urged them to forsake Valinor and the thraldom, as he named it, of the Valar, and to follow him back into the wide lands of Middle-earth, there to make war upon Morgoth and recover the Silmarils and carve out kingdoms of their own. And in the heat of that speech, Foinir and his 7 sons leaped up and swore a terrible oath, calling upon the name of Ilúvatar himself and upon the everlasting dark as witness, vowing to pursue with vengeance and hatred to the ends of the world any being, Vala or elf or man or creature whatsoever that should take or keep a Silmaril from their possession. Let me bring you close now to one figure among those 7. For the great oath had a near, inhuman face. Madras, the eldest son of Fëanor, was tall and of fiery temperament like his father. But there was in him more wisdom and more mercy than the oath would ever let him show. And it is told that even as he raised his hand to swear, a shadow of dread passed over his heart. For he sensed dimly the unending sorrow into which the words would bind him. Yet he swore, because his father swore, and because his brother swore, and because in that hour of grief and darkness it seemed unthinkable to stand apart from his own blood. And so he chained himself in a single rash moment of loyalty and love to a doom that would devour his entire house. There is a particular tragedy in this that I want you to carry gently into the dark, child, that the oath was sworn not chiefly out of evil, but out of grief and out of love, and that this is precisely why it could never be broken and never be fulfilled, but only suffered to the bitter end. The doom did not wait long to begin its work. As the host of the Noldor marched away north along the coast, they came to the city of the Teleri, the kin who loved the sea, and Fëanor demanded their swift white ships to bear his people across the great water to Middle-earth. But the Teleri would not give up their ships, which were the loveliest of their works and beloved as living things. And they would not aid a march that the Valar had not sanctioned. And so there came to pass the first and most grievous of all the deeds of the exile, the kinslaying at Alquandu. The Noldor seized the ships by force, and the Teleri resisted, and elf slew elf upon the white keys under the stars, kinsman against kinsman, in the first shedding of elvish blood by elvish hands in the history of the world. I will not dwell upon that sorrow, for it is a stain that lies over the whole of the elder days, and the telling of it is heavy. It's enough to say that the ships were taken, and that the Noldor went on with their hands no longer clean. Then, as the host passed northward, there came a dark figure upon a high rock, or perhaps it was a voice out of the very air, speaking the prophecy of the north, the doom of Mandos, in cold and measured words. It declared that the Noldor had passed under the shadow of their own oaths and their own deed of blood, that tears unnumbered should be their portion, that treason should arise even among their own kindred, and that for all their valor, their great works should fail, and their fairest hopes turn to dust. And yet it added, at the very end, a single thread of hope, that even out of all this sorrow, some good beyond their designing should at the last be wrought. Many of the Noldor were filled with fear and grief at these words, and Finarfin and a part of the host turned back and returned to Valinor and were forgiven. But Fëanor and his sons went on, and Finarfin's host followed, though many of them now followed more out of pride and out of love for their kin than out of any hope. The last act of this darkest of chapters was a betrayal within the betrayal, and it set the seal upon Fëanor's tragedy. When the host came at last to the northern shores, there were not ships enough to carry all the Noldor together, and Fëanor, who trusted none but his own following, took the stolen ships and ferried over his own people first, leaving Fingolfin's great host waiting upon the far shore, and then, on the eastern beaches of Middle-earth, at a place called Lasgar, Fëanor commanded that the white ships of the Teleri be burned, and a great red fire rose into the dark, and Fingolfin's people across the water saw the light of it and understood that they had been abandoned. So the first of the Noldor set foot in Middle-earth amid the smoke of treachery, and the second host was left to find another and far more terrible road. And the oath had already begun to set kin against kin, exactly as the doom had foretold. Let the fire sink low now, and let your breath grow slow, for we have come through a great darkness together, and there is a kind of weary peace at the end of it. Think, as you drift, of how much was lost in so short a span. The two trees, the peace of Valinor, the innocence of the Noldor, the life of a king, and the unstained love between brothers, all swallowed in a single tide of grief and pride, and a beautiful, terrible oath. And yet, remember the last word of the doom, the thin gold thread woven even into that prophecy of sorrow, that some good beyond all designing should at the last be wrought. But the Silmarils that began this ruin would, in the fullness of ages, light the way to its undoing. Sleep now beneath the stars that Arda made, the same stars under which the exiles marched, and let the smoke of Lascar fade. For in the next part of the tale, the sun and the moon will rise for the very first time over Middle-earth, and a new and stranger people will open their eyes in the east to greet them, while Fuena's people set foot upon the eastern shores amid the burning of the ships. The greater host under Fingolfin was left behind upon the coasts of Aman, betrayed and shipless beneath the stars. They would not turn back, for shame and grief and pride would not let them, and yet there was only one road left to them, and it was the cruelest road in all the histories of the Eldar, far in the north, where the Blessed Realm and Middle-earth drew near together. There lay a region of grinding ice and bitter cold, called the Helcaraxel, where great floes ground against one another over chasms of dark water, and mists hid the deadly crevasses, and the cold was such that no warmth of the heart seemed able to withstand it. Into that wilderness of ice the host of Fingolfin went in the long dark before the first dawn, because it was the only way left to a proud people who would not go home. The crossing of the Helcaraxel is one of the great sorrows of the exile, and many perished upon the ice who had done no wrong save to follow their kin into a doom not of their making. Among those lost was Elenwu, the wife of Turgon, who fell into the cold waters and was taken by them. And Turgon himself was nearly lost in trying to save her, and his grief upon that ice was a grief that he carried hidden for all the rest of his days. The host came at last to Middle-earth, fewer than they had set out, hardened by suffering and bitter against the house of Fuener that had abandoned them. And they came not in glory, but in endurance, having crossed a wasteland that should have killed them all, and there was a stern greatness in them ever after, the greatness of those who have survived what should not be survived. Let that endurance settle in your mind for a moment, child, for it is a quieter heroism than any battle, simply to keep walking in the cold and the dark, toward a land you were not sure will welcome you. And as Fingolfin's host came down at last from the ice into the northern lands, there rose into the sky for the very first time a great light, and the world was changed forever. For the valor, grieving the death of the two trees, had taken the last flower of Telperion and the last fruit of Laurelin, the final gifts of the dying trees, and from them they made two vessels of light and set them to sail across the heavens. First rose the moon, the silver flower, steered by a Maya named Tilion, and then, some while after, rose the sun, the golden fruit, borne by the maiden Arian, brighter and hotter than any light Middle-earth had known. And as the first sunrise broke over the world, in the far east of Middle-earth, in a land called Hildarine, the second children of Elvator awoke the race of men, the younger children, the followers, who opened their eyes not to the stars as the elves had done, but to the rising of the sun. This was the dawning of a new and stranger time, for with the coming of the sun the deep ancient days of the starlight ended, and the swift years of the sun began, the years in which men would live and die and pass beyond the circles of the world to a fate that not even the valor fully understood. The elves were dismayed by the new lights at first, for they loved the soft starlight and the memory of the trees, and the sun seemed to them too fierce. But they grew accustomed to it, and they reckoned the rising of the sun as the true beginning of the first age of the sun. And far away in Hildarine, the first men looked east toward the dawn with a longing they could not name, and they began their own slow westward wandering, drawn toward rumors of light and of the elder kindred, though it would be long years before their paths crossed those of the elves of Beleriand. But the house of Fuener had already met its first great grief in Middle-earth. For Fuener, in the fury of his oath, would not wait, and he pressed northward against the armies of Morgoth with too few and too rashly, trusting in his own fire. And in a battle upon the northern fields, his host was victorious, but Fëanor himself, far ahead of his people in his eagerness, was surrounded by Balrogs and was struck down by Gothmog, the lord of those demons of flame. His sons came too late to save him, and they bore him back toward the mountains, but his wounds were mortal. And so fiery was the spirit of Fëanor that, as it is told, when he died, his body fell into ash and was taken up by the wind, and no grave or token of him remained. Thus, the maker of the Silmarils and the kindler of the rebellion passed out of the world after only the briefest span in the land he had sworn to conquer, leaving his oath unfulfilled and his 7 sons bound to it, and his last act was to make them swear again to hold to their vengeance. Then Morgoth, perceiving the division and the grief among the Noldor, sought to deepen it with treachery, and he sent a feigned offer of peace and parley to the sons of Fëanor. Medros, the eldest, distrusting the offer, yet hoping to redress some wrong or to recover the Silmarils, went to the meeting with the guard. But Morgoth came with greater force in ambush, slew the guard, and took Medros captive. King, to torment the Noldor and to mock them, Morgoth had Medros hung from the sheer face of Thangorodrim by a band of steel about his right wrist, high upon the precipice above the burning pits, where none of his people could come to him. And there he hung in agony year upon year, while Morgoth offered to release him only if the Noldor would abandon their war and depart, which they could not and would not do. Here, let me bring you down close to the single deed that I love best in all this dark and divided age. For it is a deed of friendship that rose above the whole bitterness of the oath and the kinslaying. Fingon, the son of Fingolfin, had been the dear friend of Medros in the years before the darkening, before pride and grief had set their houses at odds. And though Fingon's people had every reason to hate the sons of Fëanor for the burning of the ships and the abandonment upon the ice, Fingon could not bear that his old friend should hang in torment upon the cliffs of the enemy. So he went out alone, telling no one, and climbed in secret into the very shadow of Thangorodrim, into the smoke and the dread of Morgoth's own land, with nothing but his harp and his courage. And when he could climb no higher and could not reach his friend, he did not despair, but lifted up his voice and sang an old song of Valinor, of the light before the darkness, there beneath the iron towers of the enemy. And out of the bleak air above him, a voice answered his song, for Medros, hanging in his long torment, heard the song of his friend, and cried out faintly in reply, And Fingon found him at last, far up the sheer and dreadful face of the mountain, beyond any reach. Fingon could not climb to him, and the band of steel about Medros' wrist could not be broken or unfastened. And Medros, in his agony, begged Fingon to slay him with an arrow rather than leave him to his torment. But as Fingon bent his bow with a heavy heart, he prayed aloud to Manwë for aid, and Manu, who has the eagles for his messengers, sent down Thorondor, the great lord of eagles, who bore Fingon up the cliff to where his friend hung. And there, unable to free the steel, Fingon cut off the hand of Medros above the wrist, and Thorondor bore them both away. So Medros was saved, maimed but living, by the courage and the love of one who by every reckoning of feud should have been his enemy. And this single deed did more to heal the breach among the Noldor than all the counsels of the wise. For Medros, when he was healed, did a thing of great humility that few would have looked for in a son of Fëanor. He resigned the kingship of the Noldor, which was his by right as the eldest, and gave it to Fingolfin in atonement for the burning of the ships and in honor of Fingon's friendship. So the two houses were reconciled, though the old grief was never wholly gone. And the Noldor and Middle-earth were one people again under one high king, and they turned their united strength against Morgoth. Soon after, in a great battle called the Dagor Aglareb, the glorious battle, they utterly defeated the forces that Morgoth sent against them and drove his servants back into Angband. And after this victory, the Noldor set a watch upon their iron fortress, ringing it about with their armies, in their watchtowers, and so began the siege of Angband. That siege lasted for nearly 400 years of the sun, and they were the fairest years that the Noldor knew in Middle-earth. A long high noon of their power in their making before the long defeat began in earnest. In those years, the exiled elves built kingdoms of great beauty across the wide land of Beleriand, and I will name them softly so that you may carry them into your dreams. Fingolfin and Fingin held the northern land of Hithlum, keeping the closest watch upon the enemy. Finrod-Felagund, the wisest and most beloved of the sons of Finarfin, delved the vast cavern city of Nargothrond beside a fair river and became a great king under the earth. Canturgond, who never forgot the ice that took his wife, sought out a hidden valley ringed by mountains, and there, in long secret labor, built the white city of Gondolin, the most beautiful of all the dwellings of the elves in Middle-earth, and hid it from the world. And in the heart of Beleriand, older than all the realms of the Noldor, there lay the woodland kingdom of Doriath, where Thingol the Greycloak, who long ago had stood enchanted in the wood with Melian, now reigned as king, with Melian, his Maya queen, beside him. By the power of Melian, a girdle of enchantment was woven about the forests of Doriath, an unseen wall of shadow and bewilderment that no enemy could pass against her will, so that Doriath remained an island of peace and ancient grace amid the gathering perils of the age. Within that guarded wood, the Sindar, the Grey Elves, who had never gone over the sea, kept the old starlit ways in the soft Telerin music. And there, though no one yet knew it, a destiny was ripening that would touch even the iron crown of Morgoth, for in Doriath would be born the fairest child that ever the Eldar bore. The crowning grace of those long siege years was the meeting of the two kindreds of the children. For in this age the wandering men out of the east came at last over the mountains into Beleriand. The first of them to be found was a people led by an old and wise chieftain named Bor, and it was Finrod-Felagund who came upon them and camped in a green valley, and sat among them by night while they slept, and took up a harp and sang to them of the making of the world. The men woke and listened in wonder, for they had never heard such music nor such words, and a deep and lasting friendship was kindled then between the Eldar and these Ardain, the elf friends that would endure through all the sorrows to come and would bear, in the end, the line of kings of both kindreds joined. There is a great tenderness in that first meeting, the deathless and the dying sitting together in the dark, the Eldar teaching the younger the songs of a world neither of them had made, for there was already a shadow of parting folded into that friendship, though neither kindred spoke of it at first. The elves are bound to the world and do not die of age or of sickness, and though they may be slain, their spirits do not leave the circles of the world, but pass to the halls of Mandos to await its ending. But men are made otherwise, and the span of their lives is short, and when they die, they go away beyond the world to a fate that Ilvatar has not revealed even to the Valar. The Eldar called this the gift of men, the strange freedom of mortality, and they did not understand it, and there was both envy and pity in their hearts when they looked upon it. For the elves grow weary of the long ages and the unhealing memory of all they have lost, while men are spared that weariness, but must pay for it with the brevity of all they love. So the friendship of the two kindreds was a sweet thing shadowed from the start by the knowledge that the elves would watch their mortal friends grow old and die within a span that to the Eldar was no more than a passing season, and that all such love, however true, must end in a leave-taking. And yet they loved one another none the less for that, and perhaps the more. So let us rest here, at the high point of this age, before the long defeat begins, for it is good to pause in the noon before the shadows lengthen. Picture the watchfires of the Noldor ringing the dark fortress in the north, holding the enemy penned for 400 years. Picture the white towers of Gondolin shining unseen in their hidden veil, and the enchanted twilight of Doriath, where Thingol and Melian walked. Picture the first friendship of elves and men taking root by a campfire under the new arisen stars of Beleriand. All of this stood for a while in beauty and in hope, held against the dark by vigilance and by love, and for a little while it seemed it might endure. But the stars wheel on, and even the longest siege must one day break. And in the heart of the guarded wood of Doriath, a maiden was about to be born, whose love would outface the Dark Lord himself, and whose tale is the one I shall tell you closest to the fire when the night is deepest and the world is most still. This is the tale I have been keeping for the deepest part of the night, the one that the lore masters of old set above all others. And I will tell it slowly and softly, for it is a story of love proved stronger than fear and stronger even than death by the time of which I now speak. The long siege of Angband had at last been broken in a sudden onslaught of flame, and Morgoth's power had begun to spread again over the north of Beleriand. In that ruin, the proud kingdoms of the Noldor were thrown upon the defensive, and many of the houses of men and elves were broken or scattered. Among the bravest of men in that dark time was Barahir of the House of Bor, who, with a small band of outlaws, held out in the wild fens of his lost land, refusing to flee or to yield. And once, upon a stricken field, Barahir had saved the life of Finrod Felagund, the Elven king of Nargothrond, and Finrod had given him his ring and sworn an oath of abiding friendship and aid to him and to all his kin. But betrayal found Barahir at last, for one of his own company was ensnared by Morgoth and led the enemy to their hidden camp. And Barahir and all his men were slain, save one. That one was Beren, the son of Barahir, who had been away upon an errand, and who returned to find his father and his companions dead. And Beren pursued the slayers, and recovered from them his father's severed hand, upon which Finrod's ring still gleamed, and so he kept a token of that ancient friendship. For 4 years more, Beren waged a lonely and desperate war against the servants of Morgoth in his ruined homeland, until a price was set upon his head, no less than the price set upon the great elf lords, and the land grew to perilous even for him. And it was there, in the woods of Doriath, in the spring of the year, that Beren came upon a sight that changed the whole course of his life and of the history of the world. For wandering in a glade beneath the stars, with the new leaves of the beeches above her and the hemlock umbels white about her feet, the daughter of Thingol and Melian was dancing, and her name was the fairest of all the children of Ilvator that ever were or shall be, for in her the beauty of the Eldar and the beauty of Amaya were joined. Beren beheld her in the moonlight as she sang and danced, and a silence fell upon his grief, and he stood as one enchanted, even as long ago her father had stood enchanted before her mother in another wood. And he could not speak, but stumbled toward her, and she was afraid of a strange wild man, and slipped away among the trees. So began Beren's long pursuit of her through the woods, calling to her with the only name he had for her, Tinville, which means nightingale, daughter of twilight. And at the last, in another spring, she turned to him and looked upon him, and love awoke in her also, and she did not flee again. Now Lúthien brought Beren before her father Thingol in the deep halls of Menegroth, the 1,000 caves, and there the proud great king looked with anger and contempt upon the mortal man who dared to love his daughter. Thingol would not slay him, for he had promised Lúthien he would not, but he resolved to send him to his death by another road, and so he named a bride price that he believed no living being could ever pay. He demanded that Beren bring to him in his hand a Silmaril from the iron crown of Morgoth himself, one of the holy jewels that burned upon the brow of the greatest and most terrible power in the world, deep in the pits of Angband, behind all his armies and his fear. Thingol thought to be rid of the man with this impossible quest, and he laughed, but Melian, his wife, looked at him with foreboding, for she perceived that he had bound the fate of his kingdom to the fate of a Silmaril, and that the doom of Doriath was sealed in that careless and scornful word. Yet Beren did not despair, but laughed in his turn, and swore that he would return with a Silmaril in his hand, and, he departed upon the most hopeless errand that any mortal had ever undertaken. He made his way to Nargothrond, to Finrod, Felagund, and showed him the ring upon his father's hand, and claimed the aid that Finrod had sworn long ago to the house of Bor. And Finrod, true to his oath, though he foresaw his own death in it, agreed to go with Beren upon the quest. So Finrod, seeing his people falter, took the crown of Nargothrond from his head and cast it down, and renounced his kingship rather than break his word. And he went out from his own city with only 10 faithful companions, and with Beren into the wild, while Celegorm and Curufin took the rule of Nargothrond into their own hands. The little company, disguised by Finrod's art as orcs, made their way north. But they were waylaid upon an island in the river that had once been Finrod's own watchtower, and was now the stronghold of the most dreadful of all Morgoth's servants. For there dwelt Sauron, the chief lieutenant of the Dark Lord, master of sorcery and of deceit and of cruelty, and the isle was named Tolkien-Korhoth, the Isle of Werewolves. And Sauron saw through Finrod's disguise, and cast them all into a deep pit in the dark. There Sauron set a werewolf to devour them one by one in the blackness, hoping to learn their purpose, while Finrod and Beren and their companions lay bound in the dark and would not speak. And one by one the companions were slain, until at last the wolf came for Beren. But Finrod put forth all his strength, and burst his bonds, and wrestled the werewolf with his bare hands, and slew it, and was himself slain in the slaying. And so Finrod, Felagund, the wisest and most beloved of the exiled Noldor, died in the dark to save the son of the man who had once saved him, fulfilling his oath to the very end. Let that quiet, unwitnessed death sink into you, child. The noblest of the elf kings died in a black pit beneath the earth, with no song and no banner, simply because he had given his word and would keep it. Now, in this hour, far away in Doriath, Thene had learned by the foresight of her heart of Beren's peril, and she could not bear to remain idle in her father's halls. And when Thingol, learning of her purpose, imprisoned her in a house built high in the branches of a great beech tree, she did not despair. By her own enchantment she grew her hair to a great length, and wove from it a dark cloak that cast a spell of sleep, and a rope, and so she escaped from her prison, and went out alone to seek her love. And there came to her aid the mightiest hound in all the world, Wan of Valinor, a great wolf-hound who had been given to Celegorm, but whose heart was nobler than his master's. For it was the fate of Wan that he should not die until he met the greatest wolf that would ever walk the world, and he was permitted to speak with his own voice 3 times before his death. Wan turned against the wicked counsels of Celegorm and Curufin, and bore Lúthien away to the north, to the Isle of Werewolves. And there Lúthien stood upon the bridge before Sauron's tower, and sang a song of such power that the very stones trembled, a challenge to all the dark. Sauron sent wolf after wolf against them, and Wan slew them all in silence, until Sauron himself took the shape of the greatest werewolf that had ever been, and came against them. But Wan overcame even Sauron in that wrestling, and held him by the throat. And Lúthien stood over the fallen sorcerer, and threatened to strip his spirit naked, and send it quailing back to Morgoth, unless he yielded the mastery of his tower. And Sauron, defeated and afraid, gave up the keys of his stronghold, and fled away in the form of a great vampire bat into the gloom. Then Lúthien cast down the dark tower of the isle, and broke its pits, and freed the captives, and there she found Beren, grieving over the body of Finrod the king. And they buried Finrod upon his own isle, now cleansed, and Beren and Lúthien stood together at last in the open air, alive, and the first and hardest part of the quest was done, though the worst still lay before them. They would not turn back, for the Silmaril was still unwon, and so the two of them went on alone toward Angband, into the very heart of the enemy's power, where no force of arms could ever have prevailed. At the black gates of Angband there kept watch the most terrible wolf that Morgoth had ever bred. Carcroth, the red maw, reared on living flesh and filled with a devouring fire, set there against the very prophecy that one should slay the greatest wolf of the world. Thene put Carcroth into an enchanted sleep with her power, and she and Beren passed the gates and went down into the deep halls. And there, before the throne of Morgoth himself, Thene cast aside her disguise and stood revealed, and she sang. In that breathless silence, Beren crept forward and drew the knife Angrist, the keenest blade in the world, and with it he cut a single Silmaril free from the iron crown, and the holy light of it blazed in his hand. So great was his joy that he resolved to take all three to win back for the Elves all that Morgoth had stolen. But as he set the blade again to the crown, the knife snapped, and a shard of it flew and struck the cheek of the sleeping Dark Lord, and Morgoth stirred in his sleep. Then Beren and Lúthien fled with a single Silmaril up out of the deep places toward the gates. But at the gates, Carcroth had woken from his enchanted sleep and stood barring the way, and Beren, in desperation, thrust out his hand that held the shining Silmaril, hoping its holy light would daunt the beast. But Carcroth seized his hand in his great jaws and bit it off at the wrist, and swallowed the hand and the Silmaril together. The holy jewel, which no unclean thing may touch and live, burned within the body of the wolf like a fire that could not be quenched. And Carcroth went mad with the agony of it, and fled, howling and ravening, down into Beleriand, slaying all that crossed his path. Beren lay near to death from the poison of the wolf's bite, and Lúthien drew out the venom with her lips and her power, and held the life in him. And Thrander and his eagles bore them up out of the smoking land, and set them down upon the borders of Doriath. So Beren came back at last, maimed and broken, with empty hand where the Silmaril had been. And yet he had held it, however briefly, and the quest was in a manner fulfilled. When he stood again before Thingol in 1,000 caves, and the king demanded the bride price, Beren said that even now a Silmaril was in his hand, and he raised his arm and showed the wrist where the hand had been, and told how the jewel was lost. And Thingol's heart was moved at last, and his scorn was broken, and he gave Lúthien to Beren in love. But the doom was not yet finished, for the maddened wolf Carcroth came raging into the woods of Doriath, with the Silmaril burning in his belly. And the king himself rode out with his greatest hunters, and with Beren, and with Wan the faithful hound, to slay the beast and end the terror. And that hunting of the wolf, the prophecy was fulfilled, for Wan met Carcroth, the greatest wolf of all the world. And they slew each other, each dealing the other his death, and Wan spoke for the third and last time, bidding farewell to Beren, and died. And Carcroth, in his dying rush, struck down Beren also, and tore him with mortal wounds before the beast was slain. And they cut the Silmaril from the wolf's body, and it shone clean and holy in the dusk, and they placed it in Beren's surviving hand. So Beren, with the Silmaril at last truly in his grasp, and his quest truly fulfilled, died in the arms of Lúthien upon the threshold of her father's wood, bidding her wait for him beyond the sea. Here the tale grows quietest of all, so let your breathing slow to match it. The Lúthien's spirit, undone by grief, fled from her body and went down to the halls of Mandos, where the dead of the Elves await the ending of the world. There she knelt before Mandos, the cold and pitiless judge, and she sang to him, sung the song of the sorrow of the Eldar and the grief of men woven together. The two themes of the world's third great melody joined in one voice, and it was the most sorrowful and the most lovely song that ever was or shall be sung. And Mandos, who had never before been moved to pity, was moved, and he brought the matter before Manwës, and Manwës sought the counsel of Ilvator in the deeps of his thought, and a choice was offered to Lúthien, such as had never been offered to any before. She might dwell in Valinor in bliss among the Valar until the world's end, forgetting her grief, but without Beren, who, as a man, must leave the world. She might return to Middle-earth with him, but only as a mortal, becoming subject to a second death, to age and to die as men die, and to pass with him beyond the circles of the world to a fate unknown. And Lúthien, the fairest and most blessed of all the children who might have lived forever in the light, chose mortality and chose to die, that she might not be parted from the man she loved. So Beren and Lúthien were both returned to Middle-earth and dwelt for a while in a green and hidden land. And they walked again under the sun and the moon, and they had a season of quiet joy together that they had bought with so much suffering. And in time they died, as all mortals die, and passed away together out of the world to where no tale can follow. But before that ending they had a son named Dior, and through him the blood of Beren and Lúthien, the blood of men and elves, and even of the mire, flowed down through the long ages. And one of the Silmarils, one out of the Iron Crown of Morgoth, remained in the keeping of their line. Sleep now, child, on the gentlest thought in all the histories, that love once stood unarmed before the throne of the Dark Lord and was not afraid, and that a song of grief moved even the Lord of the Dead to mercy, and that a lady who could have lived forever chose instead a short and mortal life for love, and counted it worth the price. Now I must tell you of the breaking of all that beauty, and I will tell it as the old lore masters did, with the battles kept far off and dim, like thunder heard beyond distant hills, for there is no comfort and no purpose in dwelling upon slaughter. It's the long siege of Angband, which had held for nearly 400 years, was ended at last in a single dreadful day, when Morgoth, who had been secretly gathering his strength, loosed it all at once. Rivers of fire poured down from Thangaradrim across the northern plain, and with them came forth for the first time in his full and terrible glory, the great dragon, the father of dragons, and a host of Balrogs, and a sea of orcs beyond counting. And the green plain that the Noldor had watched for an age was burned to a cinder in an hour. This was the day Gur Bergalach, the battle of sudden flame, and in it the watch upon Angband was broken forever. And the realms of the Noldor were thrown back, and many of their strong places were overrun. In the despair of that defeat, Fingolfin, the High King of the Noldor, was filled with a wrath and a grief so great that they overcame his reason, and he rode out alone in a madness of valor, all the long way to the very gates of Angband. There he smote upon the doors, and challenged Morgoth himself to single combat, naming him coward and craven before all his host. And Morgoth, though he feared and hated to do it, could not refuse the challenge before his own servants, and came forth. He came as a dark tower, clad in black armor, wielding a great hammer like a falling hill, and Fingolfin stood against him, shining like a star, with his sword ringle that glittered like ice. 7 times Morgoth smote, and 7 times Fingolfin sprang aside, and 7 wounds the Elf King dealt to the Dark Lord, so that Morgoth cried aloud each time. But at the last the king grew weary and stumbled, and was crushed beneath the foot of the enemy. Yet even in dying Fingolfin hewed a final stroke and nailed the great foot to the earth, and the black blood smoked from the wound. And Thorndar the eagle came down and raked Morgoth's face with his talons, and bore away the king's broken body. And from that day Morgoth would ever halt upon one foot, and his face was scarred, and the wounds of Fingolfin never ceased to pain him. Remember that, child, when the dark seemed strongest, that the greatest of the enemies of the world was left limping and scarred to the end of his days by the courage of a single soul who knew he could not win, and rode out anyway. After this came the long, slow ruin, with grief upon grief, and at its center stood a battle so terrible that it was named the Nirneath Arnediad, the Battle of Unnumbered Tears. For Medros, the eldest son of Foinir, sought to gather all the free peoples of Beleriand, elves and men and dwarves, into one great union to throw down Morgoth before it was too late. And the host that assembled was the mightiest that the Eldar ever raised, but Morgoth had sown treachery among the men of the east whom he had brought to his service, and in the very crisis of the battle these turned upon their allies, and the day was lost. And the flower of the Elves and the Edain was cut down upon that field, and Morgoth's victory was well nigh complete. Among the bravest there were 2 brothers of the house of Hadar, Hin and Huar, who held the rear at the pass of Sirion, so that Turgon, the king of Hin Gondolin, might escape with his people and bear his secret city's hope away unbroken. And Huar was slain by a poisoned arrow, while Hin fought on alone after all his men were dead, hewing down enemies until his axe withered, crying out with each blow the words Oru and Tuluva, day shall come again. At the last he was buried beneath the bodies of his foes and taken alive, the only captive Morgoth desired, for the Dark Lord had a special torment in mind for the man who had defied him to the end and who knew the secret of where Gondolin lay hidden. For Rin would not betray that secret, not for any threat or any pain, and so Morgoth devised a crueler vengeance than any rack or fire. He set Rin in a chair of stone upon the heights of Thangarodrim, and laid upon him a spell so that he could not move or die or age. And he cursed all the kindred of Rin with the doom of darkness, and then, by his sorcery, he made Rin to see, through the Dark Lord's own eyes, all that befell the children whom he loved, far away in the lands below. Hold this image in your mind as the quiet heart of this chapter, for it is the most terrible and the most patient suffering in all the histories. A father bound motionless upon a cold mountain, year after year, forced to watch from afar as everything and everyone he loved was led, step by slow step, into ruin, and unable to lift a single hand to help them, or even to weep. There is no battle in all the chronicles as cruel as that stillness. And the doom that Rin watched unfold was the tragedy of his son Trin, whom men called Tarambar, master of doom, though in the end it was doom that mastered him. Trin was a strong and noble and ill-fated man, brave and loyal, but proud and quick to wrath. And the curse of Morgoth dogged his every step and turned his every good intention to grief. He was fostered in the safety of Doriath, but in his pride he slew a man by misadventure and fled into outlawry. He became a great captain among the elves of Nargothrond, but his council drew that hidden kingdom out into the open, and Glorin the dragon came and laid Nargothrond's waste, and Trin was bewitched by the eyes of the worm and stood frozen while his people were enslaved by the dark workings of the dragon's malice and the spell of forgetfulness it laid upon his sister Númenor. Brother and sister met as strangers, not knowing one another, and were wed. And when at last the truth was uncovered, after Trin had slain the great dragon at the cost of his own dark despair, both Númenor and Trin cast themselves to their deaths in grief and horror at what the curse had made of them. I tell this tragedy quickly and softly and turn my face from its worst parts, for it is the bitterest of all the tales of men, and its lesson is only this, that even the bravest and the best may be broken by a malice greater than themselves, and that this breaking is not their shame, but their sorrow. So the house of Hadar came to its grief, and Hin watched it all, and was released only at the very end, an old and broken man, to wander the ruined land and to deepen its sorrows further before he passed. Meanwhile, the doom drew in also upon the most ancient and most guarded of the elven realms, the woodland kingdom of Doriath, and it came not by the open assault of Morgoth, but by the slow poison of the Silmaril, exactly as Melian had foreseen. For after Beren and Lúthien died, the holy jewel that Beren had won came at last to their grandson Dior, who took up the kingship of Doriath. But before that, while Thingol yet lived, the old king had given the Silmaril to the dwarves of Nograt to be set in a marvelous necklace, the Noglamir, the fairest work of their hands. And a lust for the jewel woke in the dwarves, and a quarrel arose over the wage and the ownership, and in the deep halls of Menegroth the dwarves slew Thingol, the Grey King, who had ruled in Beleriand since the starlit years before the sun. At the death of her husband, the grief of Melian was such that she could no longer remain in Middle-earth, and she let fall the girdle of enchantment that had protected Doriath for so long, and she departed back over the sea to the gardens of Lúthien whence she had come, leaving the wood unguarded for the first time in an age. So the protection of Doriath failed in a single hour of grief, and the kingdom that no army of Morgoth had ever breached lay open at last. And though Beren, in one final deed before his death, recovered the Númenor and the Silmaril from the dwarves, the doom of the jewel was not finished. For when the Silmaril came to Dior and shone again and restored Doriath, the surviving sons of Fuena heard of it, and the old oath woke in them like a wound that will not close. And they came against Doriath in arms and demanded the jewel, and when it was refused, they fell upon their own kind. So came the second kinslaying, elf against elf, in the very halls of Menegroth, and Dior was slain, and his realm was destroyed. But his young daughter, Elewing, was carried away by a few faithful servants, and with her went the Silmaril, fleeing south toward the sea, and the last refuge of the Elves at the mouths of Sirion. Through all this long ruin, there was one of the Valor who did not forget Middle-earth, nor wholly abandon it, and that was Olmo, the Lord of Waters, who loved the world and the children more dearly than any pomp of the West. He could not openly defy the counsel of the Valar to remain apart, and yet his power ran in every river and every rain and every wave that beat upon the shores, and through the waters he sent warnings and guidance to those who would heed them. It was by his will that Tuor was led down the secret ways to Gondolin to give Turgon counsel and warning of its doom, and it was his voice in the rivers that troubled the dreams of the wise. And though his warnings were too often unheeded or came too late, his faithfulness was a quiet sign that the powers had not utterly turned away. Hold to that, child, in the darkest part of the tale, that even when help seems wholly withdrawn, there was one who never ceased to whisper hope through the running water, and who was already shaping the road by which a ship might one day sail into the west. In the last and most beautiful of the hidden realms to fall was Gondolin, the white city in the ring of mountains, which Turgon had kept secret for centuries while all the rest of Beleriand burned. Its fall came, as the fall of bright things so often does, through betrayal from within. For Meglin, the king's sister-son, who nursed a forbidden love for Idriel, the king's daughter, and a dark envy in his heart, was captured while mining beyond the mountains against the king's command, and he bought his life and his desire by revealing to Morgoth the secret path into the hidden vale. So at last the host of Morgoth came over the encircling mountains in the dead of a festival night, with dragons and balrogs and a multitude of orcs, and fell upon the unsuspecting city. And Gondolin, the fairest dwelling of the Elves that ever was in Middle-earth, was given to the fire. Turgon the king perished in the ruin of his tower, refusing to flee. And Meglin laid hands upon Idril and her young son in the confusion. But Tuor, a man of the house of Hadar, who had come to Gondolin, guided by the will of Olmo, and had wedded Idril, cast the traitor down from the high walls to his death. A remnant of the people of Gondolin escaped through a secret tunnel that Idril and her foresight had caused to be made, and fled up into the cold mountain passes. But a Balrog and a host of orcs overtook them in a high and narrow place called the Eagle's Cleft. There Glorfindel, golden-haired lord of one of the houses of Gondolin, turned and fought the demon of flame alone upon a pinnacle of rock above a sheer abyss to save his people. And they slew each other, and both fell together into the chasm. And Thorindir bore up the body of Glorfindel, and they buried him beneath a green mound, where afterward flowers bloomed in that barren place. So the survivors came down at last, weary and few, to the mouths of Sirion by the sea, and among them was a child, the son of Tuor and Idril, a child in whom the blood of men and of elves was joined, and his name was Erendel. And in that small refuge by the waves, the last free remnants of the elves of Beleriand were gathered together, Elewing with her Silmaril among them, with the whole of the ruined country at their backs. Let the fire burn down very low now, for we have come to the end of an age of the world, and it is right to grieve a little before we go on. Almost everything that was made in the long, bright morning of the Eldar in Middle-earth is gone now, or going. The 2 trees long dead, the siege broken, Fingolfin crushed, Nargothrond laid waste, Doriath fallen, and its girdle let down, Gondolin burned, the noblest of the elf kings dead in a black pit, and the bravest of men bound upon a cold mountain to watch his children die. This is the long defeat in its fullness, the slow grinding down of beauty by a malice that never sleeps and never tires, and the lore masters did not hide it or soften it, for they believed that hope means little if it has not first looked the darkness full in the face. And yet, even here, at the very bottom of the age, there is a thread of light that the dark could not swallow, for a single child stands on a beach at the edge of the ruined world with a holy jewel in his mother's keeping, looking out over the sea toward the west, where the war dwell, with the war dwelt, where dwell, aye, well as, Sleep now through the worst of it, child, for in the next part of the tale, that child will grow and build a ship and sail where no living soul has sailed before, to beg the mercy of the powers for a world that has all but destroyed itself, and against all the weight of this long darkness, he will not be turned away. So we come to the ending of the first age, and though it begins in the deepest dark, it rises at the last into the only kind of light that the long defeat can ever yield, a light bought with sorrow, and shining all the brighter for it. At the mouths of Sirion, in the last free haven by the sea, the scattered remnants of the Elves and the Edain dwelt together, and their Irindil, the mariner, grew to manhood, the son of Tuor and Idril, in whose veins ran the blood of the 3 houses of the Edain and of the kings of the Noldor, and even of Milion the Maya. He wedded Eluing, the daughter of Dior, who had borne out of the ruin of Doriath the Silmaril of Beren and Lúthien. And so, in that one marriage, were gathered both the last hope of the kindreds and the bright and perilous jewel that had brought ruin to all who held it. Irindil's heart was ever drawn to the sea, and he built a fair white ship named Thingolot, and sailed upon the wide waters, seeking, though he scarcely knew it, a road into the west, in the mercy of the Valar. But the Silmaril could not rest, and the doom of the oath was not yet spent. For the surviving sons of Fëanor, Medros and Maglar, and their brothers, learned at last that the jewel they had sworn to recover was held at the havens of Syria. They sent demands for its surrender, and Elwing would not yield it, for it was the heirloom of her house and the price of all her kindred's grief. And so the sons of Fëanor came in arms against the last refuge of the Elves, and there was wrought the third and most lamentable of the kinslayings. The havens were despoiled, and many were slain, and the worst of all the deeds of the house of Fëanor was done in the very twilight of the age. And yet, even in that ruin, the doom turned aside, for Eluing, rather than surrender the Silmaril to the slayers of her people, cast herself with the jewel from the cliffs into the sea. But Omo, the Lord of Waters, who loved her line, bore her up and changed her into the form of a great white bird, with the Silmaril bound shining upon her breast. And she flew over the dark waves, seeking her husband, and came at last to the ship of Erendil far out upon the water, and fell down upon its deck. The twin sons of Erendil and Eluing, 2 small children named Elrond and Elrose, were taken captive in that sacking, and you might think they would have been slain. But here, at the very bottom of the long tragedy of the house of Fëanor, there is a strange small mercy, that I want you to hold on to. For Maglar, the second son, who was a singer and whose heart had been hollowed out by the endless oath, took pity on the two children and would not let them be harmed, and fostered them. Okay? And the love grew between the captor and the captives that none had looked for. A cad. So even amid the wreckage of the third kinslaying, the oath that devoured everything it touched was for once cheated of a cruelty, and two children who would shape all the ages to come were spared by the mercy of one of the very men who had ruined their home. There is no neatness in this child, and I do not offer it as a comfort that wipes away the wrong. I offer it only as a true thing, that even in the worst of hearts, a thread of pity may survive. It may matter more in the end than all the swords. Now, Eärendil, finding the Silmaril come to him in this wise out of the sea and the sorrow, understood at last what he must do. And he turned the prow of Vingwalla toward the uttermost west, to attempt what no living being had ever achieved. With a holy jewel bound upon his brow to light his way, he sailed beyond all the maps of the world, to forgive the long rebellion of the Noldor, and to come at last to the aid of the world that the enemy was devouring. He spoke not for himself, for he had renounced any return, but for the two kindreds in their extremity. And the Valar heard him, and his plea was not denied. So at the last the Valar were moved, and they set aside their long withdrawal, and they raised a great host to march against Morgoth, the most beautiful and most terrible army that the world had ever seen or would ever see again. The Vanir came forth in their shining ranks, and the Noldor, who had remained in the blessed realm, and the Mire in their power, led by Enwu, the herald of Manwë. And they crossed the great sea in a fleet without number, and came upon the northern lands of Middle-earth like a tide of light. I will not paint the battle for you, for it was a cataclysm beyond the telling, a war of powers in which mountains were thrown down and the north was unmade. Let it stay distant, a glory and a terror, seen as if from very far away, like the light of a storm below the edge of the world. Morgoth's armies, which had seemed past counting, were destroyed almost utterly, and his Balrogs were slain or driven to hide in the deep places of the earth. And it seemed that his power was broken at the last. Then, in his final extremity, Morgoth loosed a weapon he had kept in reserve. A great brood of winged dragons that had never before been seen, and at their head flew Calagon the Black, the mightiest dragon that ever lived, whose coming drove back even the host of the Valar. But Eärendil came against them out of the sky, for his white ship, Vingalot, had been hallowed and set to sail now in the airs of heaven, and with him came Thorander and all the great eagles. And through a long day and a long night, Eärendil fought Calagon among the clouds, and at the last he cast him down. Calagon the Black fell upon the towers of Thangorodrim and broke them in his ruin, and so the iron mountains that Morgoth had piled above his fortress were thrown down, and the long power of the north was ended at the very last by the mariner with the Silmaril upon his brow. So Morgoth was overthrown, the great enemy who had marred the world from the first chord of the music. And he was taken and bound, and this time there was no mercy and no second imprisonment within the world. His feet were hewn from under him, and the iron crown, from which he had never been parted, was beaten into a collar for his neck. And he was thrust out through the door of night, beyond the walls of the world, into the timeless void. And there a watch is kept upon him until the end of days, when it is foretold that he shall come again for the last battle. 2 of the 3 Silmarils were recovered from his crown, and given into the keeping of Enwu. And you might think the long oath was now at last fulfilled and at peace, but it was not so. For the 2 last sons of Fëanor, Medros and Maglor, came in the night and stole the jewels from the camp of the victors, slaying the guards, for the oath would let them do no other even now. And they each took a Silmaril in hand, but the holy jewels, which had been hallowed so that no unclean thing might touch them and live, would no longer suffer the touch of the kinslayers. For the brothers had stained their hands too deeply with the blood of their own kind, and the Silmarils burned them with an unbearable pain. Medros, the eldest, who long ago had sworn the oath with a shadow of dread already upon his heart, who had hung in torment upon Thangaradrim and been saved by the love of a friend, who had tried again and again to be better than his doom, could bear it no longer. And he cast himself, with the burning jewel still in his grasp, into a great fiery chasm in the broken earth, and so ended. And Maglor, the last of the seven, the singer, the one who had once shown mercy to two small children, flung his Silmaril into the depths of the sea, and would not look upon it again. Then the great oath was spent at last, fulfilled and unfulfilled together, having devoured the entire house that swore it. Here let the tale come down, as I promised long ago, to the quietest of all its endings, the figure of a single soul upon an empty shore. For after he had cast his Silmaril into the waves, Maglor did not die, but wandered ever after along the margins of the sea, lone, the last of the proud and ruinous sons of Fwynjar. And it is told that he sang as he walked songs of pain and of regret, and that his voice could be heard in the sound of the waves upon the strand. He had outlived his father, his brothers, his cause, his city, his hope, and even his oath, and there was nothing left to him but the singing and the sea. And so he passes out of the histories, a small, dark figure at the edge of the world, his music mingling forever with the tide. There is a particular sorrow in that, gentler than the great griefs of battle, the sorrow of the one who is left, who must carry the memory of everything that is gone, and who can do nothing with it but sing. But the Silmaril of Eärendil was neither lost in fire nor in sea, for the Valar took his white ship and set it, with the holy jewel still upon its prow, to sail forever in the high airs above the world. And so Eärendil became a star, the brightest of all the stars of evening and of morning, a light of hope set in the heavens for all the peoples of Middle-earth to see. And when the survivors of the broken land looked up in their weariness and saw that new and steadfast star rising in the west at dusk, they took heart, for they knew it for a sign that the Valar had not forgotten them, and that out of all the ruin some mercy had been wrought at the last. The star you can see on a clear evening low in the west, child, the brightest of them all. The old songs say it is that very ship, still sailing, still carrying its ancient light. And whether you believe the songs or not, it is a lovely thing to think of as you fall asleep. When the war was ended and the camp of the victors broken up, the two sons of Eärendil, Elrond and Elros, were set free from the keeping of Maglor, and came among their own people again, grown now to youth amid all that ruin, 'cause in them the blood of elves and of men was joined, and because their father Eärendil had served both kindreds. The Valar granted to these two brothers a choice that was given to none other in the same way, to be numbered among the firstborn, and to share the deathless life of the elves, or to be numbered among men and to receive the gift of mortality and the freedom that lies beyond the world. And the two brothers, though they loved one another dearly, chose differently, and were parted by their choosing for all the rest of the world's long history. Elrond chose the life of the elves, and remained in Middle-earth as a lord and a keeper of wisdom through all the ages to come. But Elrond chose the fate of men, and became the first king of the new land that the Valar had raised, and the founder of a royal line of mortal men. Hold the gentleness of that parting in your mind, child, for it is the seed of much that follows. Two brothers standing on the same shore, loving one another, and choosing one to stay and one to go, and knowing that they would not meet again until the unmaking of the world. And so the first age ended, drowned and broken, and yet not without hope. Valerian sank almost wholly beneath the sea, and all the kingdoms and battlefields and enchanted woods of the long tales I have told you tonight passed under the waves, so that the very land of the elder days became a memory and a grief. And the survivors, elves and the faithful men, crossed eastward over the mountains into the lands that remained, or sailed home into the west. But the Valar did not forget the courage of the Edain, the men who had fought and suffered alongside the elves through all the long defeat without ever turning to the enemy. And as a reward and a refuge for the weary remnant of those 3 faithful houses, the powers raised up out of the sea a new land, a great star-shaped island in the Wurtel Ocean, nearer to the blessed realm than any mortal land had ever been. Sleep now through the drowning of the old world, child, for it is a heavy sorrow, but a clean one. And dream forward to that new green island rising, shining from the waves, for upon it the men of the West will build the mightiest kingdom that mortals have ever raised, and, in time, will learn that even the highest of gifts can become, through pride and fear, the seed of the greatest fall of all. Now the long night turns toward a different kind of tale, for the great wars of the elder days are ended, and we enter the second age of the world, an age of building and of splendor, but also of a slower and subtler shadow than any we have yet seen. The land that the Valor had raised out of the western sea as a reward for the faithful men was named Númenor, which means westerness, the land of the west. It was also called the land of the star and the land of gift, for it was a free and unbought grace given to the Edain for their long suffering in the wars against Morgoth. It was a great island shaped like a 5-pointed star, set in the ocean between Middle-earth and the blessed realm, nearer to the west than any mortal land had ever lain. And at its heart rose a single holy mountain, Meneltarma, the pillar of heaven, upon whose bare summit the Númenorians worshipped Eru, the one in the open air and in silence, with no temple and no image. The eagles of Manwë nested upon the heights above the king's city, and were called the witnesses of Manwë. And so long as the men of Númenor kept faith, those great birds watched over them as a sign of the friendship of the powers. To rule this new land the Valor set Elros, the son of Eärendil, who had chosen the fate of men, and he was crowned the first king under the name Tar-Minitor. And the men of Númenor, the Dunedain, the men of the west, were granted a span of life far longer than that of other mortals. 3 times and more the years of common men. They grew tall and wise and fair, and they became the greatest mariners that the world has ever known, for the Valor had set in their hearts a love of the sea, though they had also set its bounds. And they sailed their tall ships far and wide, and learned the crafts of making and of healing and of star-lore, and their island bloomed like a garden in the western light. For many long centuries Númenor was the fairest dwelling of mortal men that ever was, and its people walked in the friendship of the Eldar, in the favor of the Valor, and death came to them late and gently, and they laid down their lives when they were full of years, as a man lies down to a welcome sleep. This was the high morning of the kings of men, and it is good to dwell in its peace a while before the slow turning of its evening. Of Elros Tar-Minitor, it is told that he reigned over Númenor for more than 400 years and lived for 500, the longest lived of all his line, and that when his time was full, he surrendered his life of his own free will, laying down the scepter and going gently into death as one lies down at the close of a long and well-spent day. This was the wisdom of the early kings, and the grace that the faithful kept longest, to know the hour of one's going, and to meet it, not as a defeat, but as a trust kept, and a journey willingly begun, passing the crown to one's heir, while still in full strength and clarity of mind. For the Dunedain, in their first ages, understood that the long life given them was a gift and not a possession, a loan of years and not a hoard to be clutched. And the manner of a king's death was held to be the truest measure of his faith, the last and quietest of all his deeds. Hold this beside what is to come, child, for the whole sad turning of Númenor can be read in a single change, the change from kings who laid down their lives in peace to kings who clung to them in terror. And that one change is the difference between a people who trust the one and a people who have come to fear the dark. Yet, upon this great gift there was set a single condition, a fence about their freedom, and it is here that the long sorrow of Númenor begins. The Valar laid upon the Dunedain, the band, that they might sail east and north and south as far as they wished, but they must never sail west out of sight of their own shores, and never set foot upon the undying lands of Amon, for the blessed realm was not made for mortals. And the deathlessness of that land lay not in the land itself, but in those who dwelt there. And the Valar knew, with their long foresight, that if mortal men came to dwell in the west, they would not be made immortal by it, but would only be consumed with longing and made wretched by the nearness of a gift they could never possess. So the band was set in love and in wisdom to spare the Dunedain a grief they could not yet imagine. And yet offense, however kindly meant, is a perpetual reminder of the thing fenced off, and the very nearness of the deathless shore was a seed of trouble that would take long ages to ripen into ruin. Let me bring you down now to the gentlest sign of all the grace that lay upon early Númenor, for there is an intimate thread here that runs, a single silver root, through the whole long history of the kings. The Eldar of Tol Eressëa, the lonely owl within sight of the blessed realm, would sail east in their grey ships to visit the Dunedain, bringing gifts and songs and tidings of the west. And among the fairest of their gifts was a seedling of a white tree, descended in a long line from the eldest of the two trees of Valinor, whose silver light I sang to you in the deeps of this night. That tree was planted in the courts of the king in the city of Armenellos, and it was named Nimloth, the white tree of Númenor. And so long as it bloomed in the king's court, with its pale flowers that opened in the evening and filled the air with fragrance, the friendship of the Dunedain with the Eldar and the Valar endured. The white tree was the living token of that friendship and of the faith of Númenor, the small green heart of all its glory. And I ask you to remember it, child, and to mark it when its fate is told, for the felling of a single tree will one day measure the fall of the mightiest kingdom of men. In its glory, Númenor was a marvel beyond the telling, a land of white cities and green terraces and harbors full of tall ships with silver sails. And its people raised towers and havens and roads such as Middle-earth would not see again for an age. Their knowledge of the stars and the seas surpassed all others. And their healers could hold back sickness, and their craftsmen wrought works of beauty in stone and metal and glass. In the chief city, Armenellos, the golden, with the king's tower and the white tree in its court, was accounted the fairest of all the dwellings of mortal men. Yet here is a quiet and sorrowful thing that the lore-masters noted as the ages passed, that as the shadow grew in the hearts of the Dunedain and their fear of death deepened, the very gift of their long lives began to dwindle, and the later generations did not live so long as the first, as though the grace itself withdrew before their grasping. So their splendor and their dread increased together, the one outward and the other within, and the greater they made their tombs and their monuments against death, the shorter and the more bitter their lives became. For all their splendor, the Dunedain were still mortal, and as the long ages of the Second Age wore on, the shadow that the Valar had foreseen began to creep into their hearts. They lived 300 years and more, but at the last they still grew old, and still they died. And as their power and their wealth and their pride increased, the brevity of their lives, set against the deathlessness of the Eldar whom they so admired, became a bitterness to them. The early kings had laid down their lives willingly when their time was full, surrendering their breath before old age could unmake them in trust and in peace. But the later kings clung to life with grasping hands, and held their crowns until they were withered and unwilling, and railed against the doom of death as though it were an injustice done to them rather than the very gift that set men free. So the sweetness went slowly out of their long years, and the fear of the dark gathered behind their splendor, and they began to build great houses for their dead, and to seek by every art to lengthen their fading days. And the love of life curdled into the dread of its ending. Out of this growing fear there came a great division among the people of Númenor, a division of the heart that ran down through all the later generations. There were those who kept faith with the old ways, who honored the valor and cherished the friendship of the Eldar, and accepted death as the gift of Eldar. These were called the faithful, the elf friends, and they kept the elven tongues and the old reverence and the memory of where their blessings had come from. And there were those, ever the greater number, and including most of the later kings, who grew to resent the ban as a chain and the Eldar as hoarders of a deathless life that was unjustly denied to men. These were called the king's men, and they abandoned the elven speech and turned cold toward the west, and a murmur of rebellion against the Valar grew slowly in them like a sickness. The two parties did not yet come to open strife, but the rift widened with each generation, and the faithful were pushed ever more to the margins, until in the end they would have to flee for their lives. Meanwhile, the Dunedain had not forgotten Middle-earth, and in their pride and their power, they sailed back to its shores in ever greater numbers. Here too, the slow change of their hearts could be read. In the early days, they came to the men of Middle-earth, who were still wild and short-lived and beset by darkness, as teachers and friends and bringers of gifts, raising up the lesser peoples and giving them grain and wine and the knowledge of crafts, and they were welcomed as kings out of the west, almost as gods. But as the shadow grew upon Númenor, the manner of their coming changed, and where they had once come as helpers, they began to come as lords and conquerors, demanding tribute and building great fortresses upon the coasts and laying a heavy hand upon the very peoples they had once befriended. The friendship of the West turned to dominion, and the gift turned to greed. And the men of Middle-earth came in time to fear the tall ships of Númenor more than they loved them, and there was now in Middle-earth a power that watched the rising might of Númenor with hatred and with cunning, biding its time, for Sauron, the chief servant of Morgoth, had not been destroyed in the War of Wrath, but had hidden himself when his master was thrust into the void, and had crept away into the east of Middle-earth. And there, through the long, quiet centuries, while Númenor flowered, he had slowly gathered to himself the broken remnants of the enemy's power, and made himself a dark lord in his own right, the inheritor of Morgoth's malice, though never his equal in might. He desired to rule all of Middle-earth and to bend its peoples to his will, and he saw in the elves who lingered there, and in the growing empire of Númenor upon the coasts, the chief obstacles to his design. He was subtle where his master had been violent, a deceiver and a corrupter who preferred to ensnare with fair words and fair gifts rather than to break with open war. And in the central years of the Second Age, he turned his cunning upon the one people in all of Middle-earth most capable of making things of great and lasting power, the elven smiths, who, in their love of craft and their longing to preserve all that was fair, were, for all their wisdom, the most easily tempted of all. So as this chapter draws toward its close, let me turn your gaze from the Golden Island in the west back to the green lands of Middle-earth, where the next great sorrow was being quietly prepared. In a fair country east of the sea, where a folk of the Noldor, skilled beyond all others in the working of metal and gem, had made their home, there came one day a stranger of great beauty and great courtesy, who named himself a messenger of the Valar and a lover of the elves, and who offered to share with the smiths the deepest secrets of their craft. He called himself the Lord of Gifts, and he was fair to look upon and wise in counsel. And the elven smiths, in their eagerness to make and to preserve, did not perceive what lay beneath that fair seeming. For it was Sauron himself, come in a beautiful disguise, to work the slow ruin of the very people who could best have withstood him. And out of that meeting would come the forging of the rings of power, and a new and terrible chapter in the long war for Middle-earth. Sleep now in the last of the golden peace, child, both the peace of Númenor in its glory, and the peace of the elven smiths before the stranger came. For in the next part of the tale, rings will be made, and a one ring forged in secret, in a shadow that was only a murmur, will begin, at last, to take a shape that can be seen. Now I must tell you how the great deceit was wrought that shaped the whole of the age to come. And it is a tale not of open war at first, but of craft and longing turned against themselves, which is the most dangerous turning of all. In a fair green country in the west of Middle-earth, in the land called Eregia, that lay near the western gate of the great dwarf realm beneath the mountains, there dwelt a people of the Noldor, who were the most gifted in the working of metal and gem of any in Middle-earth. After the drowning of Beleriand, they called themselves the Gwatai-Myrdain, the people of the jewel-smiths. And their lord and the greatest among them was Celebrimbor, who was a grandson of Fëanor himself, the maker of the Silmarils. And in Celebrimbor, the old fire of his house ran true, the deep love of making and of beautiful things, but tempered, or so it seemed, with a gentler and more generous heart. It was upon this people, the heirs of the greatest craft and the greatest pride in all the history of the Elves, that Sauron set his cunning, for he knew that where there is great skill and great longing, there the subtlest snares may be laid. In those early and happier days, before the deceiver came, the smiths of a region lived in a rare and lovely friendship with the dwarves of the great realm beneath the mountains, Khazad-dûm, the mightiest mansion of the dwarves in all the world. Such friendship between the elves and the dwarves was uncommon, for the two kindreds were made by different powers and seldom understood one another. But in a region, the love of making was shared across that ancient divide, and elf and dwarf labored together and learned from one another and grew rich in the sharing. It is told that Celebrimbor himself and a great dwarf craftsman wrought together the western doors of Khazad-dûm, doors of surpassing beauty that opened only to a word of friendship, with the emblems of both their peoples set side by side upon them in lines of silver light. Mark that friendship, child, for it was one of the fairest things of that age and one of the most quickly lost. And remember that the same skill of hand that made those doors of friendship made also, under an evil teacher, the rings that would bring the world such grief. He came to them in a fair form and a fair name, calling himself Annatar, the Lord of Gifts. And he claimed to be an emissary of the Valar sent to aid the elves of Middle-earth in their labors, and to teach them deeper arts than they had yet known. Not all were deceived, for Gil-galad, the High King of the Noldor in the north, and the Lady Galadriel mistrusted the stranger from the first and would not receive him. But the smiths of Eregia, hungry for knowledge and proud of their craft, welcomed him gladly and drank in his teaching. And the teaching was real, and the arts he showed them were great, for Sauron held back nothing of his lore in the beginning, the better to bind them to him. And together, smith and deceiver, they began to make rings of power, rings into which were poured arts to preserve and to strengthen and to slow the weariness of the world. For this was the deepest desire of the elves in their long fading, not conquest, but preservation, the keeping of things unchanged and unstained against the slow grinding of time. And it was precisely this desire, this love of the unfading, that Sauron knew how to turn into a chain. There is a sorrow in this that I want you to understand, for it is gentler and sadder than mere greed. The elves did not want power over others, as men so often do, and they did not want gold or dominion. They wanted only to halt the fading of the world, to hold the autumn from coming, to keep Middle-earth as fair as it had been in the morning of the stars, and never let it dim. But the world was made to change, and to ask that it never change is, in its way, to set oneself against the very music of its making. And so, even this most innocent of longings, the longing to preserve what is loved, could be bent into a road that led away from life and toward a kind of beautiful, sorrowful death in life. Sauron understood this better than the elves did, and he offered them exactly what their grief most craved, the means to stop time, and in their love of the unfading, they reached out and took the gift, not seeing that to grasp the unfading too tightly is to be slowly unmade by the grasping. The greatest of all these works were the 3 rings, which Celebrimbor made last and alone by his own art and without the hand or the knowledge of Sauron. And these were the fairest and the most potent of the rings, untouched by any evil intent. One was set with a ruby and held the power of fire and of kindling hope in failing hearts. One was set with adamant and held the power of preservation and of clear water. And one was set with a great blue stone and was the mightiest of the three, holding power over air and over healing in the staying of decay. These three were unsullied by Sauron's touch, and in that lay both their safety and their peril, for they were free of his malice, but not, in the end, free of his mastery. The elves hid the making of the three even from Annatar, and in this Celebrimbor showed at last a flicker of the wariness that Galadriel had urged. But it came too late to save Irajan, for the deeper treachery was already complete. For while he taught the smiths their craft, Sauron had been planning all along a masterwork of his own to be made in secret. That would give him dominion over every other ring and every wearer of one. He went away into the east, into the land of Mordor that he had made his stronghold, into the very fire of the great mountain that the elves named Orodruin and men would call Mount Doom. And there, in that fire, he forged the one ring, the ruling ring, and into it he poured a great part of his own native power and his own cruel will. For he reasoned that if much of his strength passed into the ring, then, while he held at his command over the others, would be absolute, and he could rule the wills of all who wore the rings he had helped to make. And upon the band of the one he set, in letters of fire, words declaring its mastery, that it was the one ring to rule all the others, to find them and gather them and bind them all in its darkness. The one ring was an instrument of pure domination, made to enslave, and it carried in it so much of its maker's spirit that his fate and the ring's fate became bound together for all the ages that followed. But in the very hour of its making, the deceit was undone. For as Sauron set the one upon his finger and first spoke the words of its mastery, the elves, who wore the three, heard him in their minds, and understood in a flash of terrible clarity all that he had done. They perceived that the fair Annatar was the enemy, that the rings were a snare, and that his hand had reached, through their own beloved craft, toward the enslaving of their very wills. And, at once, they took off the three rings, and would not use them, and hid them away. Then Sauron, his treachery laid bare, and his great design half-foiled, was filled with wrath, and he cast off all disguise, and made open war upon the elves, to seize all the rings by force. And so came the war of the elves and Sauron, and the green land of a region was given to fire and ruin. Let me bring you close now to the heart of this chapter, to the figure of Silmarillion in the last days of his realm, for there is a grief here, both ancient and intimate. When Sauron's armies broke into Eregion and overran the city of the smiths, Celebrimbor fought to the last in defense of the three rings, which he had sent away in secret to the keeping of the wise before the end. And he was taken alive by Sauron and cruelly tormented to make him reveal where the rings were hidden. He gave up to his torturers the knowledge of where the 7 and the 9 lay, for those Sauron had helped to make and could in part command. Concerning the 3, the unsullied rings of his own soul-making, Celebrimbor would not speak, though it cost him his life, and he died under torment without betraying them. The same fire that made the Silmarils made the rings. The same longing that drowned Beleriand burned Eregion, paid the price of a lesson that his whole house had failed to learn. Sauron seized the lesser rings that Celebrimbor's confession had betrayed, the 7 and the 9, and he kept them to himself for a time, and afterward he gave them out to ensnare the peoples of Middle-earth. The 9 he gave to mortal men, 2 kings and sorcerers and lords who desired power and long life, and the rings gave them what they craved, but at a terrible cost, for they did not die, but faded, stretched thin across the long years, until their bodies became invisible, and their wills were wholly enslaved to the one and to its master. These became the ring-wraiths, the Nazgul, the most dreadful of all Sauron's servants, neither living nor dead, robed in darkness, the very breath of fear. And chief among them was a great king of men who became the lord of the Nazgul, the witch king, of whom you will hear again before this night is done. The 7 rings Sauron gave, or sought to give, to the lords of the dwarves, but the dwarves proved too stubborn and too hardy to be made into wraiths, and the rings could not enslave them, though they inflamed in their bearers a great and ruinous lust for gold, and so brought sorrow upon the dwarf houses in their own way. Yet the chief object of all Sauron's labor escaped him, for the 3 rings of the elves remained hidden and unstained, and they were never touched by his hand, nor seen by his eye. And they were given into the keeping of the greatest of the Eldar to be used in secret for the preservation and the healing. What was fair, but only so long as the one was lost or unworn. While Sauron held the 1 ring upon his hand, the elves dared not use the 3 at all, lest he perceive and master them. So the rings that might have done the most good lay idle through the darkest years, a power held in reserve, a hope kept folded and unused. In this same dark time, the Lord Elrond, the son of Eärendil, who had chosen the elven life, established in a deep and hidden valley among the mountains, a refuge against the storm, a house of peace and lore and healing called Imladris, which men named Rivendell. And there, and in the grey havens by the western sea, and in the golden wood where Galadriel dwelt, the elves drew back and guarded what remained, while the shadow lengthened over the open lands. Sauron's power now grew very great in Middle-earth, and in the land of Mordor, behind its ring of black mountains. He raised the mightiest fortress that the world had yet seen, the Dark Tower of Barad. Its foundations were laid with the power of the 1 ring, and could not be wholly thrown down while the ring endured. From that tower he stretched out his dominion, and he came near to overrunning all of Middle-earth and to crushing the last of the elves. But in his hour of greatest peril, aid came out of the west across the sea. For the men of Númenor, still in the days of their faith and their friendship with the Eldar, sent a great fleet to the aid of Gil-galad, and the power of Westernness fell upon Sauron's armies from the sea, and broke them utterly, and drove Sauron himself back into the east, defeated for a time. So, the first open war of the rings ended not in Sauron's victory, but in his repulse, and the elves were saved from immediate ruin. But the 1 ring was not destroyed, and Sauron was not slain, and he nursed his hatred and his designs in the dark, and above all, he conceived from that day a deep and abiding hatred for Númenor, the one power of mortals that had dared to humble him. So, as this chapter closes, the shadow has at last taken a shape and a name and a tower, and the long contest of the Third Age is set, though it has not yet come. Sauron sat in Mordor with the ruling ring upon his hand, Lord of the Nine and master of much of Middle-earth, hating above all the elves who had escaped his snare, and the men of the west who had broken his armies. And in time, as his pride swelled, he took to himself the title of King of all men, and demanded the submission of every mortal lord, in open defiance of the kings across the sea. And word of this arrogance came at last to Númenor, to its proud and mighty king, who could not endure that any other should claim the lordship of men, while Westernness stood in its glory. So the king resolved upon a thing that no Númenorian had ever dared, to sail east in force, and to humble Sauron utterly, and to make the Dark Lord bow before the throne of the Sea Kings. Sleep now, child, in the uneasy quiet before that meeting, for it is a meeting of 2 prides, the pride of the greatest of mortal kings, and the pride of the deceiver who had ruined Eärendil, and out of it will come the most terrible fall in all the histories of men, the drowning of Westernness itself, and the changing of the very shape of the world. We come now to the most terrible fall in all the histories of mortal men, the drowning of the mightiest kingdom that the race of men ever raised. And I will tell it gravely, for it is a warning written in water across the memory of the world. In the last days of Númenor, there rose to the throne a king named Ar-Pharazôn the Golden, the proudest and the mightiest of all the line of Elros, who seized the scepter by force and took to wife against her will his own cousin, the rightful heiress, and ruled with a strength and a splendor that the world had never seen in a mortal man. He had heard that Sauron in Middle-earth had taken to himself the title of King of Men and demanded the homage of all mortal lords, and his pride could not endure it. And so he gathered the whole might of Númenor into a great armament, a fleet that covered the sea from horizon to horizon, and sailed east to humble the Dark Lord and to make him bow. So vast and so terrible was the power of Westerness arrayed upon the coasts of Middle-earth that Sauron's own servants deserted him, and Sauron perceived that he could not overcome the Númenorians by force of arms. Therefore Sauron did a thing of deepest cunning, the most fateful surrender in all the chronicles. He humbled himself and came out from his stronghold and gave himself up as a captive to Eärfärzin, and let himself be carried away as a hostage to Númenor itself. It seemed a great triumph, the King of Men kneeling to the King of Westerness and being borne in chains across the sea. But it was the doom of Númenor that sailed home in those ships, for no prison could hold the spirit of Sauron, and no chains could bind his tongue. Within a few short years the captive had become the counselor, and the counselor had become the master of the king's mind. For Sauron was the subtlest liar in the world, and he found in the heart of the aged and death-fearing king the one crack through which all his poison could be poured. He whispered that the Valar had deceived the Dunedain, that the ban was a chain set to keep men in slavery and ignorance, and that the true Lord of the world and the true giver of freedom and of unending life was not Eru the One, who was a phantom invented by the Valar, but the great darkness, whom Sauron now bade the Númenorians worship. So the people of Númenor, who in their first ages had worshipped the One upon the bare summit of the holy mountain in silence and in reverence, returned to the worship of the dark, and a great temple was raised, and upon its altar living men were burned in sacrifice. And most often the victims were the faithful, those who still kept the old reverence and would not bow to the lie. And there came the deed by which the fall of Númenor is forever measured, the felling of the White Tree. For Sauron counseled that Nimloth, the white tree that had stood in the king's court since the early days, and was the living token of the friendship of the Eldar and the faith of the Dunedain, should be cut down and burned upon the altar of the dark. And, though the faithful pleaded, the king at the last consented. Let me bring you close now to a single brave deed in that darkening court. For it is the intimate heart of this chapter, and the small green thread on which the whole future hung. Among the faithful there was a young man named Isildur, the grandson of the Lord of the Faithful and a descendant of the kings. And when he learned that the white tree was to be felled, he resolved that its line should not perish utterly from the world. So in secret and in great peril he made his way by night into the very court of the king, past the guards, to where Nimloth still stood. And he stole a single fruit from the doomed tree before the axe could fall. He was discovered and wounded in his escape, and came near to death, and bore the scars of it ever after. But he brought the fruit away, and it was planted in secret, and from it grew a sapling of the white tree that the faithful guarded as their dearest treasure. So, when Nimloth itself was hewn down and burned, the line of the tree of the west did not die, because one young man counted it worth his life to save a single seed. And that child is the first of the two great choices of Isildur, and the noblest, and I want you to hold it bright in your mind, for the second choice will be very different. The faithful were now hunted and slain, and their leader, Amadel, the father of Elendil, and a man of great wisdom and faith, perceived that the doom of Númenor was very near. Remembering the old tale of Irindel, who had sailed into the west to beg the mercy of the Valar, Amadel resolved to attempt the same desperate voyage, to sail forbidden west, and to cast himself upon the pity of the powers and plead for his people before the end. And he set out alone into the sunset, and was never heard of again, And whether he came to the blessed realm or was lost upon the way, no tale can tell. Okay. But before he went, he charged his son Elendil and his grandsons Isildur and Anarion to make ready ships and to keep the faithful gathered upon the eastern shore, watchful and prepared, so that if the worst should come, some remnant might be saved. So Elendil, whose name means elf friend, made ready a small fleet of 9 ships, and laded them with the heirlooms of the faithful, and with the sapling of the white tree, and with 7 seeing stones, the palantir that the Eldar had given to their fathers. And they waited at anchor in the east, in dread for the doom that was coming. For Sauron had poured his last and greatest lie into the ear of the king, the lie that struck at the deepest fear in the heart of every mortal, that death was the enemy, and that immortality could be seized by force if only the king were bold enough to take it. He told Ar-Pharazôn that the deathless life of the Valar lay in the land of Ammon itself, and that if the king would but sail west and wrest the undying lands from the powers, he and his people would live forever and need never fear the dark again. And the king, old now and consumed with terror of his own approaching end, believed him. And he built the greatest armament that had ever been, a fleet and a host beyond all reckoning, and in defiance of the ban that the Valar had set in love at the very founding of his land, he set sail into the forbidden west to make war upon the gods and to steal from them the gift of unending life. When the great fleet of Númenor broke the ban and the prows of Ar-Pharazôn's ships drew up upon the shores of the blessed realm itself, the Valar laid down their guardianship of the world, for this was a matter beyond their authority to mend. And they called upon Eru, the One, and Il-Vader answered. I will tell what followed quietly and with awe, for it was not a battle but a judgment, the direct and terrible intervention of the Maker into the world he had made. Great chasm opened in the sea, and the fleet of Ar-Pharazôn was swallowed into the abyss. And the king and his warriors who had set foot upon the forbidden land were buried beneath falling hills, imprisoned in the caves of the forgotten until the last battle in the end of days. In the land of Númenor itself, the star-shaped island, the fairest dwelling of mortal man, was shaken and broken and drowned beneath the waves, with all its cities and its towers and almost all its people, and it sank into the depths of the sea, and was called ever after Atalanto, the downfallen. And the holy mountain went down under the green water, and the glory of Westernesse was ended in an hour. And in that same hour the very shape of the world was changed forever. For the blessed realm of Aemon and the lonely isle of the Eldar were taken away out of the circles of the world and hidden, set beyond the reach of any mortal voyage. And the world, which had been flat, with the west lying upon it like a far shore, was bent and made round, so that a ship sailing west would only come round again to the east. And the old straight road to the undying lands was closed to all save the Elves, whose grey ships alone might still find the hidden way. So the deathless lands passed out of the mortal world entirely, and men were shut within the circle of the earth and the seas, with no road west and no hope of a man, and the long sundering of men from the powers was complete. Sauron himself was caught in the drowning, and his fair body, in which he had walked as the beautiful Annatar and the persuasive counselor, was destroyed and could never be remade. And though his spirit was not slain, for he was a deathless spirit, he could never again take a form that was pleasant to look upon, but only shapes of terror and of dread, and his malice fled back to Mordor, robbed of its mask. But Elendil and his sons, and the faithful in their 9 ships, were not drowned, for they had kept faith, and a great wind out of the west caught their sails and bore them up and away upon the towering waves, eastward, and cast them at the last upon the shores of Middle-earth, alive. There, in their grief and their deliverance, the survivors of Westernesse founded new kingdoms, the realms of the Dunedain in exile, and they were, too, in the north, Elendil established the realm of Arnar, and he was the high king over all. And in the south, His sons Isildur and Anarion, together, founded the realm of Gondor, with its great city and its tower and its harbors upon the river. They planted the sapling of the white tree in the courts of Gondor, so that the token of the old faith bloomed again in a new land. They set the 7 palantori in their high towers, so that the far-sundered realms might see one another and take counsel across the leagues. And they brought with them the memory and the lore and the broken hope of the drowned land, and called themselves, with sorrow and with pride, the men of the West in exile. Now Sauron returned to Mordor in a shape of terror, but with his cunning undiminished and the one ring still upon his hand, looked out and beheld these realms of his ancient enemies, the Númenorians, established upon his very borders. And his hatred was rekindled, and he made war upon them. But Elendil did not stand alone, for the last great king of the High Elves, Gil-galad, still reigned in the north. And he and Elendil made a great league, the last alliance of elves and men, the final time that the 2 kindreds marched together in their full strength against the shadow. Their host passed into Mordor and won a great battle upon the plain before the Black Gate, and they laid siege to the dark tower of Barad-dûr for long and weary years. And in those years, Anarion, the son of Elendil, was slain, and many of the noblest of both kindreds fell, for the siege was bitter and the enemy was strong. At the last, Sauron himself came forth from his tower to do battle, and Gil-galad, the elven king, and Elendil, the king of men, together stood against him upon the slopes of the fiery mountain. And they overthrew him, but at the cost of their own lives, for both were destroyed by his power, and Elendil fell, and beneath him his great sword, Narsil, broke in 2. Then Isildur, the son of Elendil, he who long ago had saved the fruit of the white tree, stooped over his father's body in grief and wrath, and took up the broken hilt-shard of Narsil. And with that jagged stump of a sword, he struck the one ring from the hand of Sauron, ta'en, and in that moment Sauron was vanquished. For so much of his power and his will had passed into the ring that with its taking his spirit was unmade and fled, formless and wailing, into the shadows, and his body perished, and the dark tower's strength was broken, and the last alliance had its victory. But here came the second great choice of Isildur, and it was the very opposite of his first, and it undid much of what the victory had won. For the wise counseled him to cast the one ring at once into the fire of the mountain where it had been made, the only fire that could unmake it. But Isildur looked upon the ring, beautiful and warm and shining in his hand, and the will of it was already upon him, and he would not destroy it. He claimed it as his own, as a worgold for the death of his father and his brother, and he kept it. And so the one chance to end the shadow forever was let slip, and the seed of all the sorrows of the age to come was carried away in a closed fist. And the ring was faithless to its keeper, as it was faithless to all save its master. Not long after, as Isildur journeyed north to his father's realm, he and his guard were ambushed by orcs beside the great river at a place called the Gladden Fields. And in the disaster, Isildur sought to escape by putting on the ring, which made him invisible, and slipping into the water to swim away. But the ring betrayed him, and slid from his finger in the dark current, and Isildur was revealed and slain by the arrows of the orcs, and the one ring sank to the bed of the river and was lost, and lay hidden in the mud in the water for long ages, while all the world forgot where it had gone, or even that it endured at all. Sleep now, child, upon that quiet and fateful image, the small golden circle settling silently into the dark riverbed, while above it the world believes the shadow ended and the victory won. For the ring did not perish, and Sauron was not dead, but only diminished and waiting. In the long third age that now begins is, in truth, only the slow and patient interval between the losing of the ring and its finding, when at last the smallest hands in all of Middle-earth will lift it up out of the dark. So begins the age in which the great deeds of the past dwindle into memory and legend, and the world grows older and grayer, and the proud kingdoms of men sink slowly toward their evening, while a patient shadow waits in the east for its hour. This was the third age, the longest of the ages of the sun, and for much of it, the One Ring lay lost in the riverbed, and Sauron was but a nameless dread, yet the diminishing of the free peoples went on all the same. For the world wears away, even when no great enemy strikes at it. And the chief sorrow of this age is the slow fading of glory rather than its sudden fall. In the north, the realm of Arnor that Elendil had founded did not endure as one, but was divided among heirs and weakened by quarrels until it had split into small and failing kingdoms that could not stand together. And against these weakened northern realms there arose a deadly enemy in the high cold lands, a sorcerer king who ruled the realm of Angmar and bent all his malice to the destruction of the Dunedain of the north. He was no mortal lord, though few then knew it, but the chief of the Nine Ring Greats, the lord of the Nazgul himself, the Witch King, set there by Sauron's will to undo the work of Elendil. And in the end he succeeded, and the North Kingdom was broken, and its last king was lost in the icy waters of a northern bay, and the line of the kings of the north came to an end. Yet that line was not wholly extinguished, only hidden, for a remnant of the Dunedain of the north survived the ruin of their kingdom. And they became a wandering and secret people, the Rangers, gray and weather-worn, who kept watch over the empty lands and guarded the simple folk who lived there without ever knowing they were guarded. Among these Rangers, the heirs of Isildur preserved their ancient lineage in quiet, fathers passing to sons the shards of the broken sword of Elendil, and the memory of a kingship long fallen, waiting through the long centuries for an hour that might never come. There is a deep and patient nobility in this child that I want you to mark. A royal house brought down to wandering and obscurity, hunted and homeless, keeping faith with a hope so distant that to most it would have seemed mere foolishness, holding the broken sword from generation to generation against a day no living man had seen. The Witch King, his work in the north accomplished, passed away south to the land of Mordor, and there he gathered the other Ringwraiths to him, and seized a fair city of Gondor, and made it a place of dread, from Weena's Morgul, the tower of black sorcery, from which a cold fear crept out over the lass with a black beckly ale with the wild seeds, word seeds, cades, and where I, For the southern realm of Gondor, mightier and more enduring than its northern sister, was also slipping into its long decline, though more slowly and with greater splendor. Gondor was wasted first by a bitter civil war over the right to the crown, the kinstrife, in which kinsmen slew kinsmen, and much of its strength and its fleet were destroyed. And afterward came a great plague out of the east that swept away a great part of its people, and left its cities half empty, and the white tree withered in the court. The line of its kings grew thin, and at last failed altogether, for the last king of Gondor, in his pride, accepted a challenge to single combat from the Witch King of Minas Morgul, and rode out to the gates of that dreadful city, and was never seen again. To him, no king sat upon the throne of Gondor, and the rule of the realm passed to its stewards, faithful lords who governed in the king's name and kept his empty throne and his broken crown, swearing each in turn to hold the rule only until the king, any king ever until the king, which we and fewer believed, though I and fewer and fewer believed, though I and fewer 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 and you and so we and so and few and when and well I'm not Now, in the midst of this long fading, when it seemed that the free peoples were left to dwindle alone, help came quietly out of the west. Not in armies, but in the persons of 5 mysterious strangers who appeared in Middle-earth in the guise of old men. These were the Istari, the wizards, and though they seemed to be aged men, they were, in truth, spirits of great power, of the order of the Mire, sent by the Valor to contend with the rising shadow. But they were forbidden to match Sauron's might with might, or to rule the peoples by force or fear. Rather, they were sent to counsel and to kindle, to stir up the hearts of elves and men and dwarves, to resist the darkness by their own free will. And to do this, they clothed themselves in weakness and in age, and most of them hid their true nature. 2 of them passed away into the far east and south and vanished from the histories of these lands. One, Radagast the Brown, became a lover of beasts and birds and forsook the affairs of men. And the 2 who mattered most to the tale were Saruman the White, the chief of the order, wise and learned and proud, and Gandalf the Grey, the wanderer, the least in seeming, but the greatest in faithfulness, whom the elves called Mithrandir, and who was in truth that same Olorine, wisest of the Mire, of whom I sang to you in the very first hour of this long night. It is told that when Gandalf first came ashore out of the west, the eldest of the elves of the Grey Havens, the shipwright Círdan, looked into his eyes and perceived who he truly was and how heavy a labor lay before him. Círdan secretly gave into his keeping one of the 3 rings of the elves, the ring of fire, set with a red stone, whose power was to kindle courage and to rekindle hope in hearts grown cold. Gandalf bore that ring hidden upon his hand through all his long wanderings, and never used it for show or for might, but only to warm the spirits of those he traveled among, and to keep alight the small fires of resistance in a darkening world. Of all the wizards, he alone never sought a tower or a realm or a following of his own, but went up and down the lands on foot, friendless and homeless by choice, asking nothing and giving much. It was this humility, more than any spell, that made him in the end the deadliest of all Sauron's foes. For the shadow was indeed returning, though it crept back in disguise. A darkness gathered in the great forest of greenwood, so that men renamed it Mirkwood, and at its southern end, in an old hill fortress called Dol Guldur, there came to dwell a nameless terror that men called only the Necromancer. And the wise feared it, but did not at first know what it was. In time, it was perceived that the Necromancer was no less a sorcerer, but Sauron himself, slowly regathering his scattered spirit and his strength after the loss of his body in the drowning of Númenor. And the chief among the elves and the wizards formed a council, the White Council, to take thought against him, with Saruman as its head, and Gandalf, and the Lady Galadriel, and the Lord Elrond among its members. Yet, even within that council of the wise, the long sickness of the age was at work, for Saruman, set to study the lore of the Rings of Power, began in secret to covet the one ring for himself. And his study turned slowly to envy, and his envy to treachery, though he hid it long behind his white robes and his fair words, and none yet knew that the chief of the wizards had begun to fall. And here, while kings failed and wizards schemed and the shadow gathered, the lost ring of power stirred at last from its long sleep in the riverbed and came back into the tale through the smallest and meanest of hands. For 2 folk of a small river-welling people went fishing near the Gladden fields, and one of them, named Deagle, was pulled into the water and found upon the riverbed a ring of gold, beautiful beyond anything he had ever seen. And his friend, named Smeagol, looking upon it, was seized at once by a desire so sudden and so consuming that he demanded the ring as a birthday gift, and when it was refused, he murdered his friend for it. So the very first deed that the recovered ring inspired was the murder of one friend by another, a small and squalid crime in a lonely place, and yet the true beginning of all the great events to come. Smeagol took the ring and was cast out by his people for his wickedness, and he crept away into the dark tunnels beneath the mountains, and there the ring, which gives a kind of dreadful, unnatural length of life to mortals who keep it, preserved him and twisted him over the long centuries into a wretched, hating, hidden creature, who called the ring his precious and Nord with his precious, and writing creating crees, me and sounds, as I is outs, and me too, and I'm sorry, and was named at the last only Gollum for the sound he made in his throat. For nearly 500 years the ring lay hidden in the roots of the mountains with that ruined creature, doing nothing, biding its time, till chance, or something deeper than chance, for in this tale the great turnings often come by the smallest accidents, brought a stranger into those very tunnels. Far away the dragon Smaug had long ago seized the great dwarf kingdom under the lonely mountain and its mountain of treasure, driving the dwarves into exile, and, at the last, a company of those dwarves set out to reclaim their home, and with them, almost by accident, went a small and unadventurous person of yet another little-known people, a hobbit named Bilbo Baggins. It is one of the quiet marvels of all this history that the road from a dragon's hoard should have crossed, in the deep dark beneath the mountains, the road of a lost golden ring, and that neither the dwarves, nor the hobbit, nor the wretched creature in the dark had the least idea what hung upon their meeting. Now the hobbits were a small and gentle folk of whom the great chronicles had taken little notice, for they did not seek wars or crowns or fame, and they dwelt quietly in a green and well-tended country in the northwest called the Shire, where they kept their gardens and their fields and their many comfortable meals, and asked nothing of the wide world but to be left alone. They were shorter than dwarves, with curling hair and tough bare feet, and they loved peace and good food and the small pleasures of an ordered life, and they were thought by the few who knew of them at all to be of no importance whatsoever in the affairs of the mighty. And yet the wise, and Gandalf above all, had begun to perceive a strange toughness hidden in these little people, a quiet endurance and an unlooked-for courage that could outlast the proud when the proud had broken. And it would prove, before the end, that the smallness and the homeliness of the hobbits, their very lack of grasping and of grandeur, was exactly the strength the great ones lacked, and the reason the heaviest of all burdens could be entrusted to them when it could be entrusted to no one else. And it happened that in the goblin tunnels under the misty mountains, Bilbo was separated from his companions in the dark, and crawling lost and alone along the cold passages, his groping hand fell upon a small ring of gold lying forgotten. At last, let it in his pocket. Let me bring you very close now to that small, dark moment, for it is the quiet hinge upon which the whole fate of the world would turn, and it is the intimate heart of this chapter. Bilbo, lost in the blackness, met Gollum beside his hidden lake, and the two of them played a game of riddles for Bilbo's life. The creature hungering to eat him, and the hobbit desperate to find his way out. And when Bilbo won the game, and Gollum, enraged, came hunting him to kill him, Bilbo, by chance, slipped on the ring and found himself invisible, and so escaped. At the very end, as he fled, Bilbo came upon Gollum unawares, between himself and the only way out, and he might easily have killed the wretched creature and gone free. And his hand went to his small sword, and for a moment he stood with the creature's life in his power. But a sudden understanding and a sudden pity rose in the hobbit's heart, a pity for this miserable thing that had lost everything and lived in the dark with nothing but its hunger, and Bilbo could not bring himself to strike. And instead he leaped over Gollum in the dark and fled, and spared his life. Remember that mercy, child, above almost everything else in this long night, for it was the smallest of deeds, done by the least of persons, in the deepest of darknesses, and yet upon that single act of pity, the saving of the whole world would one day hang. Bilbo escaped the mountains, and went on with his companions. And in time, the dragon Smaug was slain, and the dwarf kingdom, under the mountain, was restored, though only after a great battle of many armies before its gates. And Bilbo came home at last to his quiet green country, the Shire, bringing with him a little magic ring that he thought no more than a useful trinket for slipping away from unwelcome visitors. And in that same season, far to the south, the White Council put forth its strength at last, and assailed Dol Guldur, and drove the necromancer out of Mirkwood. But this was no true victory, for Sauron had only feigned retreat, and his purpose was already accomplished, for his strength was now great enough to return openly to his own land. So Sauron passed back into Mordor, and raised again the Dark Tower of Barad-dûr upon its old foundations, and declared himself openly at the last. And the 9 ring-grace went forth, and the long-feared darkness came out into the light of day. And now he lacked only one thing to make his dominion complete, the one thing he had lost upon the slopes of the mountain an age ago, the ruling ring, which lay, all unknowing, in a drawer in a hobbit's hole in a forgotten green corner of the world. So, let the fire sink low, child, for we have come almost to the end of the long history, and the last and greatest of its sorrows and its hopes is near. The shadow has risen again, and named itself the Ring-Grate's Ride. The wise are divided, and one of them has secretly fallen. The realms of men are old and weary and kingless, and yet, against all of that gathering darkness, there is set only a small and golden circle, resting quietly in the keeping of a small and gentle person who wants nothing more than his garden and his books. Gandalf the Grey had begun in those last years to grow uneasy about Bilbo's little ring, to wonder why it lengthened his life and clung to him so, and a cold suspicion had begun to grow in the old wizard's heart that he hardly dared to speak aloud. Sleep now upon the threshold of the last tale, for in the next and final part of our long night, that suspicion will become a certainty, and the smallest hands in all of Middle-earth will be asked to carry the heaviest burden in all the world, all the long and terrible way to the fire where it was made. And so we come to the last tale of the long night, the tale in which all the threads of all the ages I have told you are gathered up together and brought the very edge of ruin to their ending. And it is fitting that the greatest matter in the history of the world should turn at the last upon the smallest of its peoples. The old hobbit Bilbo, after many quiet years, gave up his magic ring at last, though only with great pain, and only at the urging of Gandalf. The thing had begun to cling to him and to gnaw at him, keen, and he left it, with all his other belongings, to his young heir Frodo, and went away to rest in Rivendell. But Gandalf's old suspicion had hardened by then into a terrible certainty, and by long study, and at last by casting the ring into a fire to read the letters that rose burning upon it, he proved beyond doubt that this little trinket of Bilbo's was none other than the one ring of Sauron, the ruling ring, lost an age ago, and now, by all the strange turnings of fate, come to rest in a hobbit's quiet hole. So the heaviest burden in all the world was laid upon the gentlest of shoulders, and Frodo, who wanted nothing but his garden and his books, learned that he held in his keeping the one thing that the Dark Lord desired above all else, and that it could not stay hidden, and could not be used, and could be unmade only in the fire where it was forged, in the very heart of the enemy's land. So Frodo set out from the Shire, not knowing the way and not believing himself equal to the task, with 3 faithful companions of his own small people, his gardener Samwise, who loved him, and his cousins Merry and Pippin, who would not let him go alone. They were hunted from the first by the 9 ring-grades, who had ridden out of Mordor in search of the ring, robed in black, and filling all who met them with a deadly fear. And the hobbits were pursued and nearly taken, and Frodo was wounded by a blade of dread upon a lonely hill. and would have died or fallen into shadow had they not won through at last. With the help of a grey-cloaked ranger who befriended them to the safe house of Elrond in the hidden valley of Rivendell. And there, in that last homely refuge, the wise of many peoples gathered in council to take thought for the ring. And there it was decided, against all the urging of pride and of fear, that the ring must not be wielded by anyone, not even in the best of causes, for it was wholly evil and would corrupt any hand that used it, but must be carried into Mordor and cast into the fire and destroyed. It was a council of despair and of hope together, for the road led straight into the enemy's own land and seemed to offer no chance of return. And yet, when the question came of who should bear the ring upon that hopeless road, it was the small hobbit, Frodo, who rose and offered himself, though he did not know the way and was filled with dread, because he saw that someone must, and that it had somehow come to him. So was formed the Fellowship of the Ring, 9 companions set against the 9 riders, the 4 hobbits, and Gandalf the wizard, and the ranger, who was, in truth, Aragorn, the hidden heir of Isildur, and the last claimant to the thrones of the Dunedain, and a proud man of Gondor named Boromir, and an elf and a dwarf, Legolas and Gimli, set side by side in spite of the old estrangement of their peoples. Together they went south in secret through the winter, seeking to pass the mountains. And when the high passes were shut against them, they were driven to take the dark road, the long-abandoned underground halls of Moria, the very dwarf kingdom of Khazad-dûm, whose doors of friendship Celebrimbor had helped to make in the bright years of the Second Age, now an empty blackness full of orcs and of an older terror. For in the deeps of Moria there dwelt a Balrog, a demon of shadow and flame out of the elder days, one of the last of those dreadful spirits that had served Morgoth and had hidden itself in the roots of the mountains when his power fell, and it rose against the Fellowship as they fled across a narrow bridge above a black abyss. And Gandalf the Grey turned and stood alone upon the bridge against the demon of fire to hold it back so that his companions might escape. And he broke the bridge beneath it, and the Balrog fell into the chasm. But as it fell, it caught the wizard with its whip of flame and dragged him down into the dark after it. So Gandalf was lost, and the Fellowship fled out of Moria in grief, believing their guide and their wisest member dead. And they came for healing and rest to the golden wood of Lothlorien, where the Lady Galadriel dwelt, keeper of one of the 3 rings, in a land where the old beauty of the Elves still lingered like a light from a vanished age. There they were sheltered and counseled and given gifts for the road ahead, small things that would prove great in their hour. And there Frodo, looking into the lady's mirror, saw glimpses of what might come to pass, and felt the full weight of the darkness that lay before him. But the Fellowship could not hold together, for the ring worked upon the hearts of those who traveled near it, and the proud man Boromir, longing to use it to save his own besieged city, was overcome at the last by its temptation, and tried to take it from Frodo by force. Frodo, in terror, put on the ring and fled, and resolved to go on alone, for he saw that the ring would destroy his companions one by one if he stayed with them. And so the Fellowship was broken upon the wooded hill of Amon-Hen. Boromir, coming to himself and bitterly ashamed, redeemed his fall in the only way left to him, when a host of orcs fell upon the company. He died defending the 2 youngest hobbits, Merry and Pippin, fighting until he was pierced through with many arrows, and his last breath was spent in repentance and in the defense of the small. The orcs carried off Merry and Pippin captive. Aragorn and Legolas and Gimli set off in pursuit of them across the plains, and Frodo and Samwise, alone of all the Fellowship, turned their faces east toward Mordor, 2 small figures setting out across a wilderness toward the black gate of the enemy, with no army and no hope but the faint chance that the very smallness of their errand might let it slip beneath the notice of the Dark Lord. Now the histories of the war divide into many streams, and I will tell them swiftly and keep the battles dim and far, for it is the small road that matters most. Gandalf, it proved, was not wholly lost, for he had fallen with the Balrog into the deep places and fought it through fire and water to the cold peak of the mountain. Ender had thrown it down and slain it, and had himself passed through death and been sent back, his task unfinished, returning now as Gandalf the White, greater than before. In the land of Rohan, the horse lords of the plains, he roused the old King Theoden from the spell of despair that Saruman's whispers had laid upon him. For Saruman, the fallen wizard, had revealed his treachery at last, and had built an army in his fortress of Isengard to seize the lands of men for himself. But the captive hobbits, Merry and Pippin, had escaped into an ancient forest and woken its keepers, the Ents, the slow shepherds of the trees, oldest of living things. And the Ents, in their long-gathered wrath, marched upon Isengard and broke it utterly. And the treachery of Saruman came to nothing, and his power was thrown down. And upon the fields of Rohan the riders held back a great assault of Saruman's host through a long night at the fortress of Helm's Deep, until the dawn and the coming of Gandalf turned the tide. And so the western men were not overwhelmed, and were free to ride at last to the aid of Gondor. For the great blow was now falling upon Gondor, the chief realm of men, whose white city of Minas Tirith stood as the last great bulwark against Mordor. And Sauron loosed all his strength against it. The Lord of the Nazgul himself, the Witch King who had destroyed the North Kingdom an age before, led the assault, and the armies of Mordor crossed the river and laid siege to the city and broke its gate, and it seemed that the last hope of men would fall in fire. But in that darkest hour, two deliverances came together upon the Pelennor fields before the city. The horse lords of Rohan rode down out of the dawn with their horns blowing and fell upon the besiegers. And when the dreadful Witch King came against their fallen king, it was a woman of Rohan, Eowyn, who had ridden to battle in secret, and the small hobbit Merry at her side, who together slew that great terror whom no man could kill, fulfilling an old prophecy that no living man should be his bane. And up the great river came black ships that the defenders feared were fresh enemies, but upon them came Aragorn, the heir of Isildur, who had passed by a perilous road through the very paths of the dead, and summoned the spirits of oath-breakers to his banner. And he came as a king out of legend to the aid of the city, and the siege was broken, and the field was won, though at bitter cost, and the old king of Rohan lay among the slain. Yet even this great victory could not win the war, for so long as the ring endured, Sauron could not be defeated, and he had strength enough to overwhelm the free peoples in the end. So the captains of the West took a desperate counsel, the boldest and most hopeless gamble of the whole age. They would march what little host remained to them straight to the Black Gate of Mordor and offer open battle, not because they could win it, but to draw the whole attention and the whole strength of the enemy out to its northern gate, and so to leave the inner land of Mordor unwatched, that the two small hobbits creeping across it toward the mountain might have one slender, unlooked-for chance. It was a sacrifice offered in the dark, an army marching knowingly to a battle it could not survive, for the sake of an errand it could not see and could only hope was still alive. We still alive, we're still alive, with Stas, and it could see, we see it to see it, I is so well, I is so am, I is s, I is a, I is it, I is I is I is I'm was I go up next I can get walk up with the pop with what I got walk I got with my dog that what hope got and they stood at last before the Black Gate, a small company against a sea of foes, and gave the enemy battle, and waited for the end. And all the while, far away across the ash and the cinder of that dreadful land, the small road went on. And here, at the very last, let me bring you closer than I have brought you all this long night, for this is the heart of everything." Frodo and Samwise had crossed the deadly land of Mordor step by step, hiding by day and crawling by night, starving and parched and hunted, with the wretched creature Gollum following them, guiding them and plotting against them by turns, his ruined soul torn between his old hunger for the ring and a flickering, fragile loyalty to the master who had shown him a little kindness. And as they came at the last to the very slopes of the mountain of fire, the ring grew so heavy upon Frodo, so vast a weight of malice pressing down upon his small spirit, that he could no longer walk, and fell, and could not rise. Then Samwise, the gardener, who had no great deeds or lineage or power, only love and a stubborn faithfulness that would not quit, lifted his master upon his own back. For the ring, at least, he could not carry, but his friend he could, and he bore Frodo up the burning mountainside step by laboring step toward the barn, and he bore Frodo up the mill on the side, where I, Cade, Cumbicking, any, am, well, I am as, am, There is no greater thing in all the histories I have told you tonight, child, than that plain and unconsidered love. Not the duels of kings, nor the fall of dragons, nor the making of jewels, but one small, weary person carrying another up a mountain because he could not bear to leave him behind. They came at the last to the cracks of doom, to the very fire where the ring was made, and where alone it could be unmade. And there, at the final step, the burden proved too great, even for Frodo, and the ring mastered him, as it had mastered every soul that ever bore it long. For at the edge of the fire, Frodo could not let it go, but claimed it for his own, and put it on. And in that instant, all seemed lost, with a ring upon the finger of its bearer, in the heart of Mordor, and the enemy's eye turning toward the mountain in sudden, dreadful understanding. But then the creature, Gollum, who had followed them even there, sprang upon the invisible Frodo and bit the ring from his hand, finger and all. And in his mad ecstasy of triumph, gloating over his recovered precious, at the very lip of the chasm, Gollum lost his footing and fell, and the ring fell with him into the fire. So the one ring was unmade, not by the strength or the virtue of any hero, but by the working together of an old mercy and a final ruin. For had Bilbo not spared Gollum's life in the dark all those years before, and had Frodo and Sam not pitied him upon the road, there would have been no Gollum at the end to do by malice what no good hand was strong enough to do by May, with no man, with no will, with no good elves, what no well, one well more, well, we won't well, I, well, I, yes, I, am I. Remember that, child, when you are grown and the world asks you to be hard, that pity, the small and seemingly foolish refusal to strike, may prove in the end to be the very thing that saves everything. With the destruction of the ring, the spirit of Sauron was at last wholly undone and passed away into nothingness, never to take shape again. The dark tower of Barad-dûr fell into ruin, and the Nazgul perished in the air, and the armies before the Black Gate were broken and fled. The great eagles bore Gandalf into Mordor, and he found Frodo and Samwise upon a crumbling island of rock amid the rivers of fire, and carried them out alive. And so the ring-bearer and his faithful gardener were saved from the very ruin of the enemy's land. Then came the crowning of the king, for Aragorn, the heir of Isildur, was crowned at last in the White City as King Elazor, and the long line of kings was restored, and the two realms of the Dunedain were joined again under one crown after an age of waiting. And in a high and hidden place a sapling of the white tree was found, the last descendant of Nimloth and of Talperion of old, and it was planted in the courts of the city, and bloomed, a sign that the long winter of men was over and a new spring had come. The free peoples rejoiced, and the captives were freed, and the long war was ended, and for a while there was a great gladness in the world such as had not been since the elder days. And the hobbits went home at last to the Shire, the small heroes of whom the great histories had taken no notice, to find that even their quiet green country had not escaped the war. For the fallen wizard, Saruman, in his final spite, had crept there and despoiled it. And the four of them, hardened now by all they had endured, roused their gentle people and set their homeland to rights and healed the harm. And Saruman came to his miserable end. But the deepest sorrow of the victory was a quiet one, and it fell upon the elves. For the 3 rings of the elves had drawn their power, in the end, from the one. And now that the one was unmade, the power of the 3 failed also, and all that the elves had used them to preserve began at last to fade, and their long age in Middle-earth was over. The time of the elves was ending, and the dominion of men beginning, and the keepers of the old beauty knew that they must now go away over the sea into the west, by the hidden road that was left to their ships alone, and leave Middle-earth to the younger people forever. And so, slowly, the elves departed, and the world grew more ordinary, and the magic went quietly out of it. There came a gray morning at the Grey Havens by the western shore when the last ship of that age was made ready to sail, and onto it went the great ones who were leaving the world, Elrond and the Lady Galadriel and Gandalf the Grey, whose long labor was at last accomplished, and old Bilbo, and with them, to the grief and bewilderment of those who loved him, Frodo, the ring-bearer himself. For Frodo had carried the ring too far and too long, and had been wounded too deeply in body and in spirit, and those wounds could not be healed in Middle-earth, and so it was granted to him as a grace for all that he had borne, to pass over sea into the west and find his healing there, in the only land where such peace remained. God. Samwise, the gardener, stood upon the shore and watched the white ship slip down the firth and out onto the open water and dwindle into the light of the setting moon, and felt his heart break, for he was losing the friend he had carried up the mountain. And then the ship was gone, and the sound of the sea was a great quiet in him, and he turned at last and went back the long road home in the dark. And here, child, the great history closes, in the smallest and the gentlest of all its scenes. For Samwise came home through the night to his own small house in the green and mended Shire, where the light was still burning in the window, and his wife was waiting, and his child was on her knee. And he came in and sat down and drew a long breath, and was where he had always most wanted to be, in his own home with the ones he loved. After all the ages I have sung to you, the music in the dark before the world, the kindling of the stars, the making and the breaking of the Silmarils, the drowning of Beleriand and the drowning of Númenor, the forging of the rings and the long twilight and the last desperate road to the fire. After all of it, the whole vast story comes to rest at last upon a single gardener sitting down by his own hearth at the end of a long day, glad to be home. And that, I think, is the truest ending the world can give. Not a triumph that lasts forever, for nothing in the world lasts forever, but a quiet evening, a warm light in a window, a weary traveler comes safely back to the people who love him. Now, the fire here has burned down to its last red embers, and the river is still running below the windows, as it has run all this long night. And I will close the great book and let the candles gutter out. I have told you the history of the world from its first note of music to its quiet evening, and tomorrow, if you wish, we can begin to read it again from the beginning, for it is the kind of tale that only grows dearer with the retelling. But for now, it is very late, and you have traveled a long way with me through the ages, and there is nothing left in the story but rest. So close your eyes, child, and let the embers warm you. And remember, as you drift down into sleep, the gardener safe at his own door, and the white ship sailing into the light, and the small mercy in the dark that saved the world. And know that even at the very end of all the long defeats, the last word of the whole tale is not sorrow, but home. Sleep now. The story is told, and all is well. In the morning, when it comes, will be a quiet one.